At my own wedding, my mother-in-law raised her glass in front of 211 guests, looked directly at me and said, "She's only here for the money." Everyone laughed. The string quartet kept playing. My new husband laughed too, a full 3 seconds before he remembered to look embarrassed. I smiled, set down my glass of Crystal 2015, and said nothing, because at that exact moment I already knew something none of them did. I had frozen the joint investment account 40 minutes earlier from a bathroom stall, and the $840,000 my mother-in-law thought was still sitting there, waiting to be spent, no longer existed in any account she could touch. If you are watching this from a wedding reception right now, hiding in a bathroom the way I once did, comment the city you're in, then like and subscribe, because what happened 17 months after that toast is the reason I stopped smiling and started counting. My name is Elena Marchetti. I am 34 years old, I am a forensic accountant, and a founding partner at Callaway Reyes Analytics, a boutique financial forensics firm in Chicago that corporate boards call when they suspect someone inside the company is stealing, and they need proof clean enough to survive a courtroom. I have spent 11 years learning how people hide money, which means I have spent 11 years learning how people lie. And by the time Margaret Ashworth Cole raised her champagne flute that October evening at the Drake Hotel, I already had 3 separate spreadsheets open on my personal laptop tracking irregularities in my own soon-to-be husband's finances. I want you to understand that I did not marry Julian Ashworth Cole because I was naive. I married him because I loved him, and because loving someone and auditing someone are not, it turns out, mutually exclusive activities. I just didn't know yet how much auditing I would eventually need to do. There were 3 things I did not know on my wedding night. 3 separate fault lines running underneath the marble floor of my own life, and each one would crack open at a different point over the next year and a half. The first was financial. 2 weeks before the wedding, a forwarded email had landed in my personal inbox by accident, sent from an address I didn't recognize, CC'd to Julian, referencing a company called Halcyon Bridge Capital Partners LLC that I had never heard him mention in 4 years of dating. The email discussed a Q3 disbursement schedule of $192,000. Julian told me it was a typo, that his assistant had CC'd the wrong Elena. I filed the screenshot in a folder on my laptop labeled Tax Documents 2019, because I already understood, even then, that a man who tells you a 6-figure wire transfer is a typo is a man you should quietly start documenting. The second fault line was personal, and it wore perfume I didn't recognize on Julian's collar exactly 4 times between our engagement party and our wedding, a warm vanilla and amber scent that was not the crisp citrus Chanel I wore, and which I noted with the same flat clinical part of my brain that flags a duplicate invoice number in a note on my phone labeled dry cleaning. The third fault line was the one I understood least at the time and would come to understand best of all. An entire family, the Ashworth Coles of Lake Forest, Illinois, who had spent 3 generations performing wealth they no longer actually possessed, and who had, without ever saying it directly to my face, identified me as the solution to a cash flow problem they were too proud to name. Margaret's toast that night wasn't a slip. It was the truth, arriving 11 months early, dressed in a joke so the room would laugh instead of asking questions. I grew up in Cicero, on the west side of Chicago, in a 2-flat my father, Antonio Marchetti, bought with cash he'd saved working 31 years at a machine shop on Cermak Road. My mother, Renata, kept the books for 3 different neighborhood businesses off the ledger, in longhand, in composition notebooks with marbled covers, and she taught me to read a balance sheet before she taught me to drive. I put myself through the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign on a combination of scholarships and a work-study job auditing student organization budgets, which is a strange sentence to say out loud, but which turned out to be the single most useful training I ever received. Because 19-year-olds hiding $200 in unauthorized pizza expenses use exactly the same psychological tricks as 40-year-old executives hiding $4 million in shell company transfers. The scale changes, the shame-based justification patterns do not. I met Julian at a charity gala in April, 4 years before the wedding, a benefit for the lyric opera that my firm's managing partner had bought a table for, and then couldn't attend, so the table fell to me and 3 junior associates who spent the evening drinking the open bar dry and comparing billable hours. Julian found me by the dessert table, where I was standing alone because small talk at galas exhausts me in a way that reading 400 pages of forensic bank statements does not. He was 6'2", wearing a midnight blue tuxedo that fit him the way tuxedos only fit men who either have money or have spent money they don't have on the illusion of it. And he had the specific, practiced charm of someone who has never once in his life had to work to be liked. He introduced himself as Julian Ashworth Cole, I run wealth strategy at Kingsley Hartwell Advisors. And I remember thinking, with the part of my brain that never fully turns off, that wealth strategy is a phrase people say when their actual title doesn't sound impressive enough on its own. He was, it would turn out over the following 4 years, not lying about the job exactly. He was a senior client relations director at Kingsley Hartwell, a real firm with a real desk on the 31st floor of a building on LaSalle Street, and a real base salary of $110,000 a year, which is a perfectly respectable income for a 33-year-old man, and nowhere close to the income required to fund the life he was living when I met him. The membership at Butterfield Country Club his father had actually paid for and let Julian claim as his own achievement, the 2019 Porsche 911 leased in his mother's name, the wardrobe of Italian suits bought on a Neiman Marcus card his parents quietly serviced every month, the assumption, worn as naturally as his cologne, that rooms should rearrange themselves around him. I did not see any of this clearly on the night we met. I saw a funny, attentive man who asked me real questions about forensic accounting instead of glazing over the way most people did, who remembered 3 weeks later that I'd mentioned my mother's composition notebooks and asked to see one, who made me laugh so hard at a Portillo's on Roosevelt Road at 11 at night that I choked on an Italian beef sandwich and he thumped my back with genuine, unguarded panic in his eyes. I fell for that version of him completely, and, I want to be clear, I don't regret it, because that version was also real. People are rarely only one thing. The Ashworth Cole family operated out of a 9,000-square-foot Georgian colonial on Sheridan Road in Lake Forest, the kind of house with a name instead of just an address. They called it Thornfield after some ancestor's idea of what English aristocracy sounded like. And the first time Julian brought me there for Sunday dinner, 6 months into dating, his mother Margaret walked me through the house room by room, narrating provenance. That's a genuine Chippendale. We had it appraised at $60,000 2 years ago. The Persian runner in the hallway came from my grandmother's estate in Winnetka. I understood, standing in that hallway in a dress I'd bought on sale, that I was not being welcomed. I was being assessed, the way a bank assesses collateral, and I was passing the assessment for reasons that had nothing to do with who I actually was. Margaret Ashworth Cole was 61 years old when I met her, silver blonde, permanently tanned from a winter home in Boca Raton the family still owned but could, I would later discover, no longer comfortably afford, and she had exactly one operating mode in every interaction I ever witnessed her have. Absolute, unshakable entitlement, delivered with a smile so practiced it had its own muscle memory. She corrected waiters' pronunciation of wine regions. She referred to my job, every single time, not as forensic accounting, but as numbers work, said with the same inflection she used for the landscaping crew. At that first Sunday dinner, she asked me, in front of 11 people, what my father did for a living, and when I said he was a machinist, she said, "How industrious," and moved the conversation along so fast that 3 people started talking before I could finish my sentence about how he'd owned the 2 flat outright by the time he retired, which was more than Thornfield's mortgage could say. Julian's father, Richard Ashworth Cole, was 64, a man who had inherited a regional insurance brokerage from his own father and run it. According to what I would later reconstruct from public filings and industry gossip, Julian's own cousin let slip at a 4th of July barbecue, into a shell of its former self over 2 decades of expensive mistakes and expensive habits, most notably a standing Thursday golf game at Butterfield that came with a bar tab Richard treated as a personal entitlement rather than a discretionary expense. Richard's contribution to any family conversation was a variation on the same theme every time. The world owed the Ashworth Coles something for simply existing. Some deference, some accommodation, some understanding that rules calibrated for ordinary people did not quite apply to a family whose name was on a house. He called it how things are done. I came to recognize it over 4 years as the sound of a man watching his own foundation crumble and refusing, on principle, to pick up a hammer. Julian's younger sister, Vanessa Ashworth Cole, 29 when I met her, had never held a job longer than 11 months in her adult life, a fact she discussed with a bright, untroubled confidence that took me nearly a year to understand wasn't performance. It was genuine belief. She believed, the way some people believe in gravity, that opportunities were simply owed to her on a rolling basis, and that the gap between opportunities was properly filled by other people's money. She had a consulting business that had never billed a client, an Instagram page with 18,000 followers she called her brand, and an apartment in the Gold Coast whose rent, I would later confirm through documents I should not technically have had access to, was paid directly from Richard and Margaret's joint checking account, the same account that was, by the time of my wedding, overdrawn twice in one fiscal quarter. Every single interaction I had with this family, across 4 years, confirmed the same pattern, over and over, until the pattern itself became a kind of weather I simply learned to dress for. Margaret's entitlement. Richard's belief that rules were for other people. Vanessa's bottomless, cheerful opportunism, always asking, always assuming yes. Never once, in 4 years, asking me a single question about my own life that wasn't secretly a preamble to a request. I want to tell you about the specific moments that taught me this, because a pattern only becomes undeniable once you've watched it repeat in enough different rooms, with enough different props, and I watched it repeat for 4 years before the wedding, and then for another 17 months after it, until the night at the Peninsula Hotel when I stopped watching and started acting. Julian proposed on a Tuesday in March, in our apartment on Astor Street. No restaurant, no photographer hiding in the bushes, just him, on one knee in the kitchen, with a ring he told me had belonged to his great-grandmother, a 2-carat emerald-cut diamond in a platinum setting that I would later learn, from an offhand comment Vanessa made at a bridal shower, had actually been purchased 8 months earlier on a store credit line at a jeweler on Oak Street, financed over 18 months at 22% interest, a debt Julian was servicing quietly out of a checking account I didn't yet have full visibility into. I said yes, I meant it. I want to be honest about that because this isn't a story about a woman who never loved anyone. It's a story about what happens after you do. The first time I watched Margaret's entitlement curdle into something closer to cruelty was at our engagement dinner, at a restaurant on Rush Street Margaret had chosen, and, it turned out afterward, expected the bride's side to pay for, a detail my mother discovered only when the check came, and Margaret's chair had already scraped back. Her purse already over her shoulder, already halfway to the coat check, with a comment tossed over her shoulder about how the Marchettis will want to treat, of course. It's tradition on the bride's side, a tradition she had invented on the spot, in front of 11 witnesses, because it was financially convenient in that particular moment. My mother, Renata, who kept 3 businesses books in composition notebooks and never once in her life let a number get away from her, paid the check without argument, because that is who my mother is, and then cried in the car, not from sadness but from a very specific, controlled fury I recognized because I inherited it directly from her. The second time was 6 weeks before the wedding. At a cake tasting, Margaret had insisted on attending, though it was, by every convention either family observed, my decision to make with the caterer. She tasted 4 samples, declared all 4 provincial, and then, without asking, ordered a 5th from a bakery in Winnetka she preferred. Charged to the wedding budget my parents and I were splitting with the Ashworth Coles roughly 60-40. A split Margaret had proposed as generous of us, though everyone in the room understood, without saying it, that the 60% she claimed to be contributing existed increasingly on paper and decreasingly in any account with actual funds in it. I paid for the 5th cake tasting out of my own card without mentioning it to anyone, filed the receipt in the folder on my laptop, and said nothing, because I had already, by that point, started keeping 2 separate ledgers in my head, the one where I was building a life with a man I loved, and the one where I was documenting, line by line, exactly how that life was actually being financed. Richard's entitlement showed itself less in dinner table moments and more in a specific kind of silence, the silence of a man who has decided certain conversations simply don't apply to him. 3 months before the wedding, my father Antonio, who had spent 31 years reading contracts and understood exactly what he was looking at, asked Richard directly, over drinks at Butterfield during a Meet the Fathers round of golf Julian had arranged, whether Richard's insurance brokerage was in good standing. A reasonable question from one father to another before their children's finances became legally intertwined. Richard laughed, clapped my father on the shoulder, said, "Antonio, we've been Ashworth Coles in this county for 4 generations, we don't exactly need to worry about that," and changed the subject to the back 9. My father told me about the exchange that night, not as a warning exactly, but as data, because that is also how my father thinks, and I added it to the ledger. Vanessa's opportunism was the easiest pattern to document because it never once varied in method, only in dollar amount. At the bridal shower, she admired a Cartier bracelet I was wearing, a gift from my own mother, and asked with the same bright, untroubled confidence she brought to everything, whether I knew anyone at the firm who could get her an internship, despite Vanessa being 29 years old and an internship being, structurally, not a thing anyone at my firm offered to 29-year-olds. At the rehearsal dinner, she asked if I'd mind fronting her share of a bachelorette weekend in Nashville she'd organized for herself 6 weeks earlier, $430, which I paid, and which she never once mentioned again, let alone repaid, treating the debt's disappearance from conversation as equivalent to its disappearance from the world. 3 separate times across the engagement, she asked to borrow just until the trust distributes, a phrase I filed away without yet understanding exactly which trust she meant, or how thin the actual assets inside it had become. There was a 4th figure moving through the edges of this landscape during the engagement, a woman named Isabel Reyes, 26 years old, Julian's executive assistant at Kingsley Hartwell, who I met exactly twice before the wedding, both times at office holiday functions. Both times feeling, without being able to name why, a specific static in the air whenever she and Julian stood within 4 feet of each other, a kind of practiced casualness that read, "To anyone trained to notice inconsistency between stated relationship and actual behavior, as its own kind of tell." I did not at that point suspect an affair specifically. I suspected only that something in the account didn't reconcile, the way an experienced auditor feels a wrongness in a spreadsheet 3 rows before she can point to the exact cell. Our wedding took place on a Saturday in October at the Drake Hotel on North Michigan Avenue. 211 guests, a budget that had, by the final invoice, crept to $461,000 against an original estimate of $280,000. The overage covered, I would only fully understand 17 months later, primarily out of the joint investment account Julian and I had opened together the previous spring. An account I had funded with $340,000 from the sale of a Lincoln Park condo I'd owned outright before the relationship. An account Julian had told me, repeatedly and with total conviction, he was using exclusively to grow our future together, through what he described as a promising private investment vehicle managed by a colleague from business school. I stood in a bathroom stall at the Drake 40 minutes before Margaret's toast, not out of nerves about the marriage itself, but because I had, 3 days earlier, finally pulled the full transaction history on that joint account after Julian mentioned, casually, over breakfast, that the fund had performed a little softer than expected this quarter, and that we might need to be flexible about a kitchen renovation we'd been planning. Something in his phrasing, soft, flexible, a colleague from business school, triggered the exact same pattern recognition response 11 years of forensic work had trained into me, and I spent that morning, before hair and makeup, quietly pulling every statement I could access. In that bathroom stall, in my wedding dress, I froze the account's outgoing transfer authorization using an app on my phone, a 15-second action that would not stop the wedding, would not stop the marriage, but would, I decided in that moment with a coldness that surprised even me, buy time for me to find out exactly where $340,000 of my own dollars had actually gone. Then I walked out of the bathroom, took my seat at the head table, and 40 minutes later listened to my new mother-in-law raise a glass of champagne and tell 211 people that I was only there for the money. And I understood, with a clarity that felt almost peaceful, that she had accidentally told the truth about the wrong direction. I wasn't there for anyone's money. Someone in that family had been counting on mine. The venue manager who walked over to Margaret mid-toast was named Corinne Abelman, and what she leaned in to tell her, quietly enough that only the head table caught it, was that the Ashworth Cole family's card on file for incidentals had just been declined for a routine $4,200 authorization hold, and that someone needed to provide an alternate form of payment before the bar could stay open past 10. Margaret's face went white, not because $4,000 was an enormous sum to a family that size, but because it revealed, in front of the exact audience she'd spent the evening performing wealth for, that the family's liquidity had gotten thin enough for a routine hold to bounce. I watched her recover in real time, watched the practiced smile reassemble itself, watched her murmur something to Richard, who quietly handed Corinne a different card that, I would learn much later, belonged to Vanessa, who was in turn reimbursed the following week by a transfer from the same joint account I had frozen 40 minutes earlier. Meaning the transfer failed too, meaning that by the end of my own wedding night, 3 separate members of my new family had discovered, in overlapping waves of private panic, that the money they'd been quietly counting on had simply stopped moving. I did not unfreeze the account that night, or the next morning, or during the 4 days we spent on our honeymoon in Positano, where Julian was, for those 4 days, entirely the man I'd fallen in love with, sunburned and laughing and reading paperback thrillers by the pool, never once mentioning money, which I understood even then was its own kind of tell, because a man with nothing to hide asks why his wife froze a joint account within hours, and a man managing a lie waits to see how long the silence holds before he has to speak first. On the 5th day, over espresso on a terrace overlooking the Tyrrhenian Sea, he finally asked, lightly, almost as an afterthought, whether I'd noticed some kind of glitch with the investment account, because his advisor had mentioned a hold. I told him I'd flagged some irregular activity and wanted to review the statements properly once we got home, which was true. And I watched him take that answer, fold it, and put it away without argument. Which told me something too. He wasn't surprised enough. A man who genuinely had nothing to hide would have pushed harder for details. Julian just nodded and ordered another espresso. The forensic investigation I began the week we returned from Italy did not feel, at the time, like a formal investigation. It felt like homework, the kind I'd done 1,000 times for clients who were paying my firm $450 an hour to trace exactly this kind of pattern, except this time the client was me, and the subject was my own husband, and I did it at my kitchen table at 11 at night after Julian went to bed, on a personal laptop with full disk encryption I'd set up years earlier out of professional habit, backing up nothing to any cloud service either of us shared. I want to walk you through exactly how I built this case, because the mechanics matter, because this is not a story about a woman who got lucky or stumbled onto a smoking gun in a jacket pocket. This is a story about 11 years of training applied, methodically, line by line, to the person I least wanted to be right about. I started with the joint investment account itself, which I had full legal access to as a co-owner, and which showed, once I pulled the complete 18-month transaction history, instead of the monthly summary Julian usually forwarded me, a pattern that made my stomach drop the way it always does when a spreadsheet stops looking like noise and starts looking like architecture. 16 separate outgoing wire transfers, ranging from $11,000 to $62,000, all routed to an entity called Halcyon Bridge Capital Partners LLC, the same name from the email I'd filed away 2 years earlier under Tax Documents 2019. Total outflow to Halcyon Bridge across 18 months, $294,000. Total documented returns credited back to the account from Halcyon Bridge across the same period, $11,000, a single transfer, timed suspiciously close to the week I'd asked Julian a casual question about how our investments were performing, which told me the $11,000 deposit wasn't a return at all. It was a prop, staged to keep a specific question from being asked twice. I filed the incorporation paperwork request myself, through the Illinois Secretary of State's Public Business Database, which took 11 minutes and cost $25, and which told me that Halcyon Bridge Capital Partners LLC had been registered 14 months before our wedding, that its registered agent was a corporate services company in Springfield, that existed solely to register shell entities for a flat annual fee, and that its listed manager was a man named Preston Kowalczyk, 36 years old, whom I recognized, after 40 minutes of searching, as a former roommate of Julian's from his MBA program at Kellogg, currently listed on LinkedIn as Managing Director of Halcyon Bridge. With zero prior finance experience visible anywhere in his professional history, a philosophy degree from a small liberal arts college in Ohio, and, based on a public property record I found 20 minutes later, a one-bedroom apartment in Streeterville he'd been renting for 6 years, not exactly the residence of a man legitimately managing nearly $300,000 of other people's investment capital. I called my brother Daniel that night, at 11:45, and I want to explain who Daniel is, because he becomes essential to everything that follows. My brother is 38 years old, a special agent with the FBI's Chicago field office, assigned for the past 6 years to the white-collar crime squad, specializing specifically in wire fraud, investment fraud, and Ponzi-adjacent schemes. The exact intersection of expertise that meant when I read him the numbers over the phone that night, he didn't say, "Are you sure?" He said, "Read me the LLC's registration date again." Because Daniel, like me, was trained by our mother's composition notebooks to hear a pattern before he heard a feeling. Daniel could not, he told me carefully, open a federal investigation based on a sister's suspicion about her own husband, not without more, not without something that rose above irregular into provable. But he told me exactly what that more would need to look like. And he told me, in a tone I'd heard him use exactly twice before in our lives, both times about people who'd hurt someone we loved, that if I found it, he would make sure it went somewhere real. So I built it. Over the following 4 months, working in 90-minute blocks after Julian fell asleep, using techniques I'd normally bill a corporate client $80,000 to deploy, I reconstructed Halcyon Bridge Capital Partners LLC from the outside in. I subpoenaed nothing because I had no legal authority to subpoena anything, but I did what forensic accountants do when they can't subpoena. I built inference from public exhaust. Property records, court filings, Illinois business registrations for related entities, A defamation lawsuit Preston Kowalczyk had been named in 2 years earlier by a former business partner, alleging, in a since-settled complaint I found in Cook County court records, misappropriation of investor funds from an unrelated venture, a complaint that had been sealed as part of the settlement, but whose existence and initial filing remained in the public docket. A docket number, a case caption, dates, a pattern. By February, 4 months after the wedding, I had traced 11 of the 16 wire transfers to a downstream account at a credit union in Skokie, held in Preston Kowalczyk's name personally. Not in Halcyon Bridge's name, a critical distinction, because commingling client investment funds with a manager's personal account is not aggressive fee structuring. It is the textbook first step of a fraud pattern I had personally testified about in a Cook County courtroom 18 months earlier for an unrelated case. Of that $294,000, I traced $81,000 to a single outgoing transfer from Kowalczyk's personal account to a jeweler on Oak Street. The same jeweler. I confirmed by cross-referencing an invoice number Vanessa had once mentioned in passing at a family dinner, that had financed my own engagement ring, meaning that a meaningful portion of my own money had been laundered through a shell company and a college friend's personal account before returning, disguised as a family heirloom, onto my own finger. I traced another $46,000 to 4 separate payments made directly to Kingsley Hartwell Advisors, Julian's own employer, in amounts and on dates that did not correspond to any legitimate fee schedule I could find on the firm's public disclosures. Payments that I would only later understand, once Daniel's investigation formally opened and subpoena power replaced my own patchwork of public records, represented Julian quietly using investor-style transfers to cover a margin call on a separate, entirely unrelated personal trading account he'd opened without my knowledge 8 months into our marriage. An account where he had, over that 8-month period, lost $118,000 attempting increasingly aggressive options trades on a platform designed for retail investors with far less at stake than a marriage. I found the 4th thread by accident, the way the most damaging threads are usually found. Not through brilliance, but through a bank auto-categorizing a transaction, the way it categorizes thousands of transactions a day, indifferent to whose life it's about to unravel. A recurring charge, $640 a month, auto-labeled Rent Streeter Prop MGMT, debited from a checking account Julian and I did not share. An account I only had visibility into because I was, by that point, also the authorized secondary user on a joint credit card whose statements I'd started reviewing line by line every month without telling him, the way I would review any client's financials once genuine irregularities had been established. $640 a month for 11 months, to a property management company whose portfolio, according to their own public website, consisted of exactly one building, a converted loft on Streeterville, Unit 4C. I did not at that point know whose apartment 4C was. I only knew that my husband was quietly paying $640 a month towards someone's rent from an account I wasn't meant to see, on top of the $294,000 already bleeding out through Halcyon Bridge, on top of the $118,000 lost gambling on options he'd never mentioned. And I remember sitting at my kitchen table at 1 a.m, the 4th month of this investigation, doing something I almost never let myself do during the workday version of this exact task. I let myself feel it for about 90 seconds. The specific vertigo of realizing that a man who tells you he loves you every single day can, in the exact same 24-hour period, be quietly disassembling your life piece by piece. And then I closed that feeling the way I close a filing cabinet, because feeling it wouldn't trace the 5th thread, and there was still a 5th thread, and a 6th, and I had work to do. The 5th thread took 3 more weeks, and it required a tool I don't often need in corporate engagements, but which every forensic accountant keeps in her back pocket. A private investigator I'd worked with twice before on litigation support. A retired CPD detective named Frank Oyelaran, who now ran a 2-person firm out of an office above a dry cleaner on Milwaukee Avenue, and who agreed, for $1,800 paid out of my own personal savings, to conduct 3 days of routine, entirely legal surveillance on Unit 4C of the Streeterville building. Nothing more invasive than photographs taken from a public sidewalk of who came and went. On the 2nd day, at 6:47 in the evening, Frank's photographs showed Julian Ashworth Cole entering the building carrying a bag from a wine shop on Rush Street, and at 9:15 that same evening, leaving again, alone, his tie loosened, his collar slightly askew in a way I recognized because I had straightened that same collar myself 1,000 mornings. On the 3rd day, Frank photographed the woman who lived in 4C leaving for what appeared to be a morning run. Isabel Reyes, 26 years old, Julian's executive assistant, the woman whose static energy I had noticed and filed away at 2 holiday parties before my own wedding, wearing an apartment key on a lanyard around her neck that Frank's telephoto lens caught clearly enough to confirm the unit number stamped into the fob. I sat with those photographs for 2 full days before I did anything else. Not because I doubted what they showed, but because I needed the part of my brain that files evidence to fully take custody from the part of my brain that was, underneath 11 years of professional discipline, still a woman who'd married a man in a bathroom stall panic and chosen, in that same bathroom, to freeze an account instead of walking back into the reception and demanding answers in front of 211 witnesses. I want to be honest with you about that choice, because it is the choice this entire story pivots on. I did not confront Julian in October, at the wedding, when I first felt something was wrong. I did not confront him in November, when the Halcyon Bridge numbers stopped making sense. Or in December, when I traced the ring, or in January, when I found the Kingsley Hartwell margin call payments, or in February, when Frank's photographs landed in my inbox. I built the entire case first. Every thread, fully documented, fully corroborated, because I had learned, across 11 years of watching guilty people talk their way out of half-built cases, that you only get one confrontation, and a confrontation without complete proof is just an argument. And I did not want to have an argument with Julian Ashworth Cole. I wanted to have a reckoning. By late February, 5 months into the marriage, I had built what I would, in any professional context, call a complete forensic package. The shell company registration and its threadbare manager, the 16 wire transfers and their downstream commingling into Preston Kowalczyk's personal account, the $81,000 loop back through my own engagement ring, the $46,000 quietly patching a hidden options trading margin call, the $640 a month funding an apartment where my husband spent, according to 11 weeks of intermittent surveillance Frank continued at my request, an average of 2 evenings a week, and photographic documentation, however preliminary, of Isabel Reyes's residence and Julian's pattern of visits to it. I gave the complete package to Daniel on the first Sunday in March at our mother's kitchen table in Cicero, the same table where she'd once taught me to read a balance sheet. And I watched my brother go quiet in a way I had only seen him go quiet twice before, both times at funerals, and then I watched him start asking the kind of precise, procedural questions that told me the FBI agent had fully replaced the brother for the next several months, which was exactly what I needed him to do. Daniel explained, carefully, what he could and couldn't do with what I'd given him. A federal wire fraud investigation requires more than a well-documented private suspicion. It requires evidence obtained and corroborated in ways that will survive defense scrutiny, subpoena power I didn't have, formal financial records requests through proper channels, coordination with the Illinois Secretary of State's Fraud Division, and potentially the SEC given Halcyon Bridge's structure as a purported investment vehicle soliciting funds under false pretenses. What I had given him, he said, wasn't a finished case. It was probable cause, and probable cause from a forensic accountant with a spotless professional reputation and 11 years of expert witness credibility, married directly into the fraud in question, was more than enough for Daniel to bring to his supervisor and open what became, over the following 11 months, Case File 2021, CG 4471, an active federal investigation into wire fraud, investment fraud, and potential securities violations connected to Halcyon Bridge Capital Partners LLC, its manager Preston Kowalczyk, and, though this part moved slower, more carefully, requiring a level of proof Daniel wouldn't let me see until it was fully built, its principal beneficial user, my husband, Julian Ashworth Cole. Daniel's one condition, delivered with the flat clarity he uses when he's not asking, he's stating a fact I needed to accept, was this. I could not, under any circumstances, tip Julian off that an investigation existed, could not confront him about Halcyon Bridge, could not let a single detail slip that would give him time to move money, destroy records, or flee jurisdiction, because federal financial crimes cases are won or lost in the window before the subject knows he's being watched. Which meant that starting in March, 5 months into my marriage, I had to become someone I had never been before in my personal life. Someone I had only ever been on the clock for clients behind a firm's letterhead. A woman living a fully documented double life inside her own home, sleeping next to a man under federal investigation, cooking him dinner, laughing at his jokes, letting him believe, completely, that nothing had changed, while an 11-month clock quietly ran underneath every single ordinary moment of our marriage. Living that double life meant, first and most immediately, that I could not stop showing up to Sunday dinners at Thornfield, could not stop absorbing Margaret's particular flavor of entitlement across a roast chicken every single week, while knowing, with certainty she didn't have, exactly how thin the family's actual finances had become. 3 weeks into the investigation, at one of those dinners, Margaret spent 20 minutes describing, in granular detail, her plans for a spring gala she intended to host at Thornfield to benefit the Lake Forest Historical Society, a 400-guest event with a budget she quoted, without a flicker of hesitation, at $95,000. Obviously, we'll need Julian and Elena to help carry a portion. Family events are family investments. And I sat there with a forkful of roast chicken halfway to my mouth, thinking about the 11-month clock running underneath the table, thinking about how Margaret had no idea that helping carry a portion of anything for the Ashworth Coles now meant siphoning further into an account that federal investigators were quietly building a case around. And I said, of course, happy to talk logistics, and took the bite, and chewed, and said nothing else, because that was the job now. Absorb the entitlement, document the pattern, give away nothing. I want to give you 3 more scenes with Margaret across those 11 months, because her entitlement never once modulated, never once responded to any signal I gave it, which told me something important about how she actually saw me, not as a person whose patience could run out, but as a resource whose patience was structurally guaranteed, the way a trust fund is structurally guaranteed to disperse on schedule. In April, she called me directly, not Julian, to ask whether my firm could do a little consulting, pro bono obviously, family rates, to help reorganize the Historical Society's books ahead of an audit she mentioned almost as an afterthought, an audit I understood immediately, from the specific tightness in her voice when she said the word. Was not routine, was in fact triggered by irregularities a board member had flagged. Irregularities I strongly suspected, though I never formally traced it because it fell outside Daniel's case, traced back to discretionary spending Margaret herself had authorized without full board approval. I told her I'd need to check my conflict of interest policies and never followed up, and she never asked again, moving on to the next resource without registering the refusal as a refusal at all. In June, at a 4th of July barbecue held early because of scheduling, Margaret introduced me to a new circle of Lake Forest friends by saying, verbatim, "This is Elena, Julian's wife. She does numbers work. Very useful for a family like ours." A sentence that reduced 11 years of forensic expertise and a name on my own firm's letterhead to a household utility. And I smiled and shook hands and thought about case file 2021 CG 4471, sitting in a locked drawer in my brother's federal office, and said nothing. In August, Margaret asked to borrow my car for a week while hers was in the shop, a request that turned out, when Frank did some unrelated confirming legwork for me, to mean her Mercedes had been repossessed after 2 missed payments, a fact the family disclosed to no one, papering over the gap with borrowed vehicles and rotating explanations, the same instinct that had produced, "She's only here for the money," at my own wedding. Perform solvency loudly enough, often enough, and maybe the audience forgets to check the actual books. Richard's entitlement across those 11 months took a quieter, more corrosive form, expressed less in dinner table moments than in a specific pattern of silence I came to recognize as its own kind of statement. In May, over drinks Julian arranged at Butterfield to keep the fathers close. Richard mentioned with total unconcern that the insurance brokerage had lost its largest institutional client that quarter, a loss that would have meant, for any ordinary small business, months of anxious cost-cutting, but which Richard discussed the way you'd discuss weather, immediately pivoting to a story about a new boat he was considering. A 42-foot Sea Ray he ultimately did purchase in July, financed, I learned much later through documents that surfaced during the federal investigation, through a home equity line of credit against Thornfield itself. A house whose equity, it would turn out, had already been drawn down twice before, for reasons Richard never disclosed to anyone, including his own wife. In September, at a dinner where Julian mentioned, carefully, vaguely, that the market's been a little rough, testing the water for a conversation about money he never actually had the courage to finish, Richard cut him off entirely, saying, "We don't talk about that at this table, Julian. Some things are private." A rule Richard applied selectively and only ever in the direction of protecting himself from scrutiny, never in the direction of respecting anyone else's privacy. A rule he broke without hesitation 2 months earlier when he'd asked me, directly, whether my firm's partnership structure meant I'd be coming into real equity soon. A question dressed as small talk that was, underneath, Exactly the kind of due diligence a man does when he's quietly assessing what a daughter-in-law's future earnings might eventually be available to absorb. Vanessa's opportunism, across those same 11 months, became almost rhythmic in its predictability, a metronome I could set my watch to. In April, she asked to borrow $800 for a brand relaunch photo shoot, never repaid. In May, she asked whether I could get her just a small introduction to a client of mine who ran a mid-sized marketing agency, a request I declined, citing conflict policies, which she accepted with the same untroubled ease she accepted everything, already moving toward the next ask before the current one had fully landed. In July, she asked to stay in our guest room for what she described as a couple weeks between apartments, which became 11 weeks, during which she used our address for 3 different online deliveries, 8 groceries I bought without ever once offering to replace them, and referred to the arrangement in front of Margaret as Elena and Julian being so generous. A framing that let the family narrate my labor and my money as their own generosity, extended downward rather than what it actually was. In September, 3 weeks before everything accelerated, Vanessa asked me directly, over coffee she also didn't pay for, whether I thought Julian and I might help set up a small trust for her. Nothing crazy, maybe $50,000 to get the consulting business properly capitalized, phrased with the specific breeziness of someone asking to borrow a book. And I remember looking at her across that coffee shop table, this 29-year-old woman who had never once, in 5 years, asked me a single question about my own work, my own family, my own life that wasn't a preamble to a request, and thinking about the $81,000 already laundered through a shell company and a jeweler on Oak Street to fund my own engagement ring. And I said, gently, let me think about it, which was, by that point, my standard closing line for every Ashworth Cole request, a line that bought time without ever once costing me anything, because I had learned, watching this family for 5 years, that entitlement doesn't hear no. It only hears not yet, and files it as a pending transaction. The scenes with Julian himself during those 11 months were harder to hold steady, because he was not, underneath everything I was discovering, a cartoon, and I want to resist telling you he was, because the truth is more unsettling than a cartoon would be. He still remembered how I took my coffee. He still rubbed my feet on the couch after long trial prep weeks without being asked. He cried, actually cried, at his own cousin's wedding in June, moved by a reading from Corinthians, the same man who was at that exact point in time paying $640 a month toward an apartment where his assistant lived. I do not offer you these details to soften him. I offer them because the version of this story where the villain is villainous in every single frame is a story that lets you look away too easily, and I didn't get to look away. I lived inside the contradiction for 11 months, cooking dinner for a man I still, in some complicated and diminishing way, loved, while a federal case file with his name in it grew thicker in a drawer 40 minutes north of our apartment. In October, 1 year exactly after our wedding, Julian came home late from what he said was a client dinner, smelling faintly of the same warm vanilla and amber perfume I'd noted on his collar the year before. And for the first time in 11 months of forensic discipline, I nearly broke pattern. I nearly said something. I stood in our kitchen, the same kitchen where he'd proposed, and I felt the entire weight of 11 months of silence pressing up against my throat. And I looked at him, tired, still handsome, still, in some diminishing corner of my chest, someone I had once uncomplicatedly loved, and I said, instead, long day? And he said, you have no idea. And I said, I bet. And I went to bed and I lay awake until 2 in the morning doing the thing I had trained myself to do instead of breaking. I opened my laptop quietly and I updated the timeline document I kept for Daniel, dated the perfume, dated the late dinner, and closed the laptop, and that was how I survived that year. Not by feeling less, by filing it. If you have ever sat across a dinner table from someone, smiling, while quietly holding proof that would end everything, you already know the specific exhaustion I'm describing, and I promise you, the part where it finally breaks open is coming. But if this story has you gripping your phone right now, if you've already picked a side at this table, do me one favor before we go further. Hit like and subscribe, because I post a new story like this every week, and you do not want to miss the night at Thornfield, where Margaret's spring gala turned into something none of the 400 guests were expecting. What happens next took 11 more months to build, and every single piece of it was real. The full shape of Loop B, the personal betrayal underneath the financial one, didn't arrive all at once. It arrived the way most real betrayals arrive, in fragments that only become a picture once you stop refusing to assemble them. And I want to walk you through exactly how the picture completed itself. Because by November, 13 months into the marriage, I had stopped needing Frank's surveillance to confirm what I already knew in my body, and had started, instead, quietly building the kind of documentation that would matter later, in the room where it would eventually matter most. The first hard piece of evidence came from something almost embarrassingly ordinary. Julian's phone, left face up on the kitchen counter one Saturday morning while he showered, buzzing with a text preview visible from across the room. Not because I was spying in that moment, but because the phone was simply there and the notification simply appeared, the way notifications do. It read, in full, visible without unlocking anything. Miss you already, Thursday can't come fast enough, KH. From a contact saved as I Reyes KH, the same abbreviation Julian used for Kingsley Hartwell contacts, meaning he hadn't even bothered to disguise the surname, had simply trusted that I would never look closely enough at a routine work contact to notice the pattern. I did not touch the phone. I photographed the lock screen from across the room on my own phone with a timestamp and added it to the timeline document and made French toast. And when Julian came downstairs with wet hair, I asked him how he took his coffee, though I had known the answer for 4 years, because asking ordinary questions had become, by that point, its own kind of camouflage, a way of proving to myself that I could still function inside the marriage while quietly building the case that would end it. The second piece came from Frank in December, after I asked him to extend the Streeterville surveillance from the initial 3 days to an intermittent pattern across 6 weeks, documenting frequency rather than just presence. Frank's final report, which I still have, itemized 11 separate visits by Julian to Unit 4C across those 6 weeks, ranging from 40 minutes to 4 hours, clustered heavily around Thursday evenings, the same evenings Julian had told me, consistently, involved late client calls, tied to a fictional West Coast account he referenced often enough that I began to suspect the account itself, like Halcyon Bridge, existed mostly as a cover story rather than an actual client relationship. A suspicion Daniel's federal financial records requests would eventually confirm no such client existed on Kingsley Hartwell's books. The third piece came from Isabel Reyes herself, indirectly, through a public Instagram account I began monitoring in December, an account I found not through any sophisticated technique, but through the same shell company muscle memory that had cracked Halcyon Bridge. I searched her name, cross-referenced against the LinkedIn photo from years earlier, and found an account with privacy settings loose enough that anyone could see her posts, a pattern of photographs across 14 months that, laid end to end, told their own quiet story. A bouquet of ranunculus with no card visible, captioned, "Someone knows me so well, Tides," posted on a date that corresponded, in Frank's surveillance log, to a Thursday evening visit lasting 3 hours and 20 minutes. A pair of hotel slippers from the Peninsula Chicago, captioned with 3 champagne emojis, posted on a night I remembered clearly because Julian had told me he was in Milwaukee for a conference Daniel's team would later confirm, through hotel records subpoenaed as part of the broader financial investigation, that Kingsley Hartwell had no record of sponsoring. A candid photo of a man's hand holding a glass of red wine, cropped carefully above the wrist, no face visible, but wearing a watch. A Patek Philippe with a distinctive blue dial, the exact watch Julian had told me was in for repair, for 6 weeks that same winter. I did not confront Isabel. I did not confront Julian. I want to explain why, because I know how this sounds. I know it sounds like restraint, bordering on something colder than restraint, and I've made peace with that characterization, because the alternative, confronting him in December with an incomplete picture, before Daniel's federal case had matured, before I understood the full financial architecture I was still tracing, would have done exactly one thing. It would have told Julian the marriage was over before it told anyone who mattered the truth about where the money went. And Julian Ashworth Cole, given 6 months of advance warning, was more than capable of moving what remained of Halcyon Bridge's assets somewhere Daniel's team couldn't reach, of destroying records, of coaching Preston Kowalczyk on a story, of turning a case I had built for 11 months into a case that collapsed under its own incompleteness the moment defense counsel got a look at it. So I filed the ranunculus photograph, I filed the hotel slippers, I filed the watch, and I kept coming home. There is a specific texture to living inside a marriage, you know, as a performance staged for exactly one audience member, and that audience member is the person performing the opposite role, equally unaware that you know. Julian brought me flowers in January, unprompted, just because, tulips from the grocery store on Clark Street, and I put them in water and thanked him and thought about the ranunculus with no card, and felt something in my chest that I can only describe as a kind of vertigo grief. Grieving a marriage that was already, structurally, over, while still living inside its daily rituals, because ending it publicly before the case was ready would have meant losing everything I was building toward, and I had decided, somewhere around month 9, that I was not willing to lose. Not the money, not the reckoning, not the specific, cold satisfaction I could already feel waiting for me on the other side of patience. By February, 14 months into the marriage, I had a complete Loop B file that ran parallel to Daniel's federal case, entirely my own, built for a separate purpose. An Illinois divorce filing that would, when the time came, need to demonstrate not just financial misconduct, but a documented pattern of infidelity relevant to any contested asset division. Because Illinois, like most states, allows dissipation of marital assets, money spent on an affair, on gifts to a third party, on an apartment rented in secret, to be clawed back in a divorce settlement, added back to the marital estate before division, meaning that every dollar Julian had spent maintaining Isabel Reyes's apartment, every gift, every hotel room, was money I would be legally entitled to recover. Not as revenge, though I won't pretend the word never crossed my mind, but as simple, documented, forensic fact. I hired a divorce attorney in February, not Julian's family's usual counsel, obviously, but a woman named Priya Chandrasekaran, a partner at a firm on Wacker Drive with a reputation, among people who worked in complex asset litigation, for a specific kind of surgical ruthlessness, the kind that comes not from aggression but from never once losing a case to an opposing side's better preparation, because Priya was never less prepared than anyone she faced. I brought her the full timeline. Halcyon Bridge, the wire transfers, the ring, the margin call, the Streeterville apartment, the Instagram evidence, Frank's surveillance logs, everything except Daniel's active federal case file, which remained, per Daniel's explicit instruction, entirely separate and unreferenced in any civil filing until he gave the word, because a premature civil filing referencing an active federal wire fraud investigation could tip Julian off just as surely as a kitchen table confrontation would. Priya read the entire file in one sitting, in her office, while I waited. And when she looked up, she said something I still think about. In 18 years of doing this, I've had exactly 4 clients walk in with a file this complete. 2 of them were forensic accountants. She did not ask me if I was sure I wanted to proceed. She asked me, instead, when I wanted to file, and I told her, not yet. I told her I needed the federal case to reach a specific stage first, a stage Daniel had described to me only in general terms. When we're ready to move, you'll know, because we'll need you to know. And Priya, unlike almost anyone else I had dealt with across this entire ordeal, did not push. She simply said, then we wait until you're ready to move too, and when you are, I'll have the filing done within 48 hours. And closed the file, and I understood, sitting in that office, that I had finally, after 14 months of doing this entirely alone, assembled the 2 people who would help me end it. My brother, with a badge, and this woman, with a filing cabinet full of case law about dissipated marital assets. And between the 2 of them, I finally let myself believe that the version of my life on the other side of all this documentation might actually be real. Daniel's case moved the way federal financial investigations actually move, which is to say, slowly, methodically, and almost entirely invisibly to the person under investigation. A pace that tested my patience in ways 11 years of professional discipline had not fully prepared me for. Through March and April, 15 and 16 months into the marriage, Daniel's team executed a series of steps I only learned about in retrospect, because he kept me deliberately outside the operational details to protect both the case and, he told me plainly, to protect me from being called as a witness to my own investigative process in a way that could complicate the prosecution's chain of evidence. What I did learn, delivered to me in careful, general terms over dinners at our mother's house where Daniel would speak for 90 seconds and then change the subject before either of our spouses could ask follow-up questions, was this. The FBI's Financial Crimes Unit had subpoenaed Halcyon Bridge Capital Partners LLC's full banking records from the credit union in Skokie, subpoenaed Preston Kowalczyk's personal accounts, and begun interviewing other Halcyon Bridge investors because, and this was the detail that changed the entire shape of the case, the detail that turned my personal grievance into something with genuine public interest. I was not the only person who had put money into Halcyon Bridge believing it was a legitimate investment vehicle. Daniel's team identified, over the following 2 months, 6 additional investors, 5 of them connected to Julian through Kingsley Hartwell client relationships. People who had trusted Julian's professional credibility enough to move retirement savings, home equity, and in one case, a father's entire life insurance payout, into an entity that existed, in Daniel's own words during one of those careful 90-second dinner table updates, as close to a textbook affinity fraud structure as I've seen in 6 years on this squad. Total investor losses across all 7 victims, once the full accounting was complete, reached $1,140,000, of which Preston Kowalczyk had personally retained roughly 40%, using it to fund a lifestyle documented in exhaustive detail. Once subpoenaed bank records replaced my own patchwork of public information. A leased Range Rover, a membership at a private club in the Loop, and, most damning of all for the case Daniel was building, direct kickback-style payments to Julian, disguised as referral fees, totaling $86,000 across the 18-month scheme, payments that established, in a way my own personal financial losses alone could not have, that Julian Ashworth Cole was not merely a victim who'd trusted a bad friend with investment money. He was, per the eventual federal indictment, a knowing participant who had steered his own wife's money, along with the money of 5 other clients, into a scheme he personally profited from. I want to pause on that detail, because it recontextualizes everything I've told you so far, and it recontextualized everything for me too. In real time, the week Daniel finally showed me the referral fee documentation in May, 17 months into the marriage. I had spent 9 months telling myself a version of the story where Julian was weak, was in over his head, was covering an affair and a gambling problem with money that wasn't entirely his to use, but who had, underneath it, been genuinely deceived by a college friend running a scheme Julian himself didn't fully understand. That version of the story, it turned out, was generous to a man who did not deserve generosity. Julian had known, at minimum since 8 months into our marriage, based on an email chain Daniel's team recovered through the subpoena, that Halcyon Bridge's returns were fabricated, that Preston was moving money in a pattern that any wealth strategy professional would recognize as a fraud structure, and had continued not only investing our joint money but actively recommending Halcyon Bridge to 2 of his own Kingsley Hartwell clients, in exchange for referral payments he then used, in part, to fund an apartment in Streeterville, and on one occasion I confirmed independently, a weekend trip to Charleston with Isabel, that he told me was a solo golf trip with the guys from business school. By late May, Daniel told me, over a dinner where his voice finally lost its careful 90-second restraint entirely, that the case had reached the stage he'd described to me 14 months earlier. They were ready to move. A grand jury had returned a sealed indictment against Julian Ashworth Cole and Preston Kowalczyk on charges of wire fraud, conspiracy to commit wire fraud, and, for Julian specifically, given his position as a registered representative at Kingsley Hartwell, securities fraud. Charges that carried. Daniel explained with the flat clarity of a man delivering facts rather than opinions, a potential combined sentencing exposure of up to 20 years, though any actual sentence would depend on cooperation, restitution, and a dozen other factors neither of us could predict that night. What Daniel needed from me now was timing. The indictment would remain sealed, arrests would not happen, until the U.S. Attorney's Office coordinated the operational details, meaning I had, Daniel estimated, somewhere between 10 days and 3 weeks before Julian would be arrested, likely at his office or his home, in a manner the government would choose based entirely on operational logistics I had no input into. I called Priya the next morning. I told her the window had opened. She had the divorce filing, which she'd kept ready and updated for 14 months exactly as promised, filed within 31 hours, a filing that included, per Illinois law, a request for a temporary restraining order freezing all remaining marital assets, a request Priya specifically structured to be filed the same week as the anticipated federal arrest, so that the civil and criminal proceedings would land close enough together that Julian would have no meaningful window to move, hide, or dissipate any remaining assets between the two, a piece of strategic sequencing Priya described to me, without a trace of irony, as closing every door in the same afternoon so nobody has time to notice which one to run for. There remained in that final window exactly one piece I had not yet closed, and it was the piece Daniel could not help me with. The piece that belonged entirely to Loop C, to the question the whole story had been circling since the first 3 open loops, the question of how and where and in front of whom I would finally let this entire architecture become visible to the one audience who had spent 19 months believing they'd successfully hidden it from me. The Ashworth Cole family itself, and specifically Margaret, who had that same week sent out 400 formal invitations to a spring gala at Thornfield, benefiting the Lake Forest Historical Society, an event she had spent months describing to anyone who would listen as the event of the season, an event where, per the invitation sitting on our kitchen counter, Julian was scheduled to be publicly honored, alongside 3 other rising local professionals, with something called the Lake Forest Society's Emerging Leadership Award. A plaque, a 5-minute speech, and, per the seating chart Margaret had emailed the extended family 2 weeks earlier, a head table positioned directly beneath the ballroom's largest chandelier, in full view of every single one of the 400 guests she had spent 19 months performing solvency for. I looked at that invitation for a long time. Then I called Daniel back and asked him one question. Could federal agents execute an arrest at a private event if the U.S. Attorney's Office agreed the location and timing were operationally sound? And Daniel, after a pause I could hear him weighing on the other end of the line, said that arrests happened in all kinds of locations, that the operational team generally preferred controlled, predictable settings over surprise domestic arrests, specifically because a controlled public setting reduced flight risk and the possibility of a subject destroying evidence at home before agents arrived, and that if I could get him accurate details about the gala's timing, security, and Julian's expected schedule that evening, he would raise it with his supervisor as a legitimate operational option. Not, he said, pointedly, as a favor to satisfy anyone's sense of poetic justice, but because it might genuinely be the cleanest, lowest-risk arrest location available. I told him I would get him everything he needed. I already had the seating chart. The 11 days between Daniel's phone call and the night of Margaret's gala were, without question, the strangest 11 days of my life, because I spent them doing 2 things simultaneously that should have been impossible to hold in the same body. I planned, with Priya and with an operations coordinator from the U.S. Attorney's Office, named Special Agent Marcus Whitfield, the precise logistical architecture of my own husband's public arrest, while also, every single evening, coming home to that same husband, eating dinner across from him, discussing seating arrangements for a gala neither of us yet knew would end his freedom, and folding laundry, actual laundry, his shirts, the same shirts I would in 11 days watch federal agents ask him to remove his cufflinks from before leading him out of a ballroom in handcuffs. Agent Whitfield needed specifics I was uniquely positioned to provide. The venue's floor plan, which I obtained by asking Margaret, with total sincerity, whether I could help coordinate the timeline for the evening, an offer she accepted instantly and without suspicion, because in 19 months she had never once considered that my willingness to be useful might be anything other than genuine deference to the family hierarchy she believed she occupied. I learned the exact timing of the award ceremony, scheduled for 8:45 p.m., after cocktail hour and before dinner service. Positioned specifically, Margaret told me proudly, so everyone's still fresh, before the wine really kicks in. I learned that Julian's award presentation would be introduced by the Historical Society's board chair, that Julian had been asked to prepare brief remarks, that a photographer from the North Shore social pages had been booked specifically to document the award moment for the following month's Society column. Every detail Margaret handed me with pride, believing she was building the most photographed moment of her son's public life, was a detail I was quietly handing to a federal agent building the extraction plan for his arrest. Priya, meanwhile, filed the temporary restraining order and asset freeze on the Wednesday before the gala, timed deliberately so that it would not be served on Julian until Friday morning, close enough to the Saturday gala that he would have no meaningful window to respond, far enough ahead that the paperwork would be airtight and unchallengeable by the time anyone tried. When the process server reached him Friday at his office, Julian called me that evening, his voice doing something I had genuinely never heard it do before, a kind of controlled panic underneath forced casualness, and said, "Some kind of mistake happened with the accounts today. Some paperwork. I think someone's trying to scam us. I'm going to call our lawyer." And I said, gently, evenly, in the exact tone I had practiced in the mirror 3 separate times that week, "That sounds stressful, let me know what you find out," and hung up, and sat very still in our kitchen for 4 full minutes, and then I called Priya, and Priya said, "He'll spend the whole weekend trying to figure out who filed it and why before he thinks to call opposing counsel directly, which buys us exactly the window we need." And she was right. Because Julian, across that entire weekend, made 7 phone calls, I would later learn from phone records, to Kingsley Hartwell's outside counsel, to his father, to a college friend who practiced tax law, to anyone except the one number that would have actually told him the truth. Because some part of him, I believe now, already suspected what the truth would say, and was managing, the entire weekend, not a legal problem, but a feeling. Margaret called me Saturday morning, the day of the gala, in a state of controlled hysteria I had also never heard from her before, asking whether I knew anything about some kind of legal issue with Julian's accounts, a question I answered with total, practiced calm. I think there's some confusion. Julian's looking into it. I really don't want it to overshadow tonight. He's worked so hard for this award. Margaret, remarkably, chose to hear exactly what she wanted to hear, told me I was being such a rock for this family, and hung up to finish preparing centerpieces, because a woman who has spent 3 generations papering over financial reality with performance was, in her own final hours of not knowing, doing what she had always done, choosing the performance over the audit. I dressed for the gala that evening in a deep emerald silk gown I had bought specifically for the occasion 3 weeks earlier, before I fully knew what the occasion would become, and I remember standing in front of the mirror in our bedroom, Julian behind me in his tuxedo, adjusting his cufflinks, telling me I looked beautiful, and I looked at his reflection next to mine and felt something I want to describe honestly. Not triumph, not yet, but a very specific, very cold stillness. The stillness of a woman who has spent 19 months building toward a single evening and has finally arrived at its threshold. "You look happy," Julian said, and I said, "I think tonight's going to be a night we remember," which was, of every sentence I said to him across 19 months of documented deception, the only one that was completely, entirely true. Agent Whitfield's team briefed me one final time that afternoon, in Priya's office, walking through exactly how the evening would unfold. 4 agents in plain clothes would be positioned at the venue by 7:30, blending with catering and event staff. 2 more stationed at the exits, Daniel himself present. Not as lead agent on his own brother-in-law's arrest, which federal protocol prohibited given the family relationship, but as an observing agent from the broader case team. Present specifically, he told me, because you shouldn't have to watch this alone, and because I've earned the right to be in that room. The arrest would happen, per Whitfield's plan, immediately following the award ceremony, timed so that Julian would be standing at the podium, microphone in hand, plaque in the other, at the exact moment agents approached. A timing decision Whitfield described purely in operational terms. Subject stationary, in a known location, minimal flight risk, controlled crowd, but which I understood. Walking into that ballroom at 7:15 that evening in my emerald gown would also be, whether Whitfield intended it this way or not, the precise moment that would finally, publicly, permanently answer the question Margaret had asked in a joke 19 months earlier, at my own wedding, about which one of us had actually been counting on the other's money. Thornfield's ballroom, the same ballroom where I had eaten roast chicken through 19 months of quiet documentation, had been transformed for the gala into something out of Margaret's own private mythology. 400 guests in black tie, a string quartet in the corner playing something baroque and expensive sounding, round tables draped in ivory linen and centered with the exact $95,000 arrangement of white peonies and eucalyptus Margaret had spent 3 weeks agonizing over, waiters circulating with trays of champagne, and above it all, the chandelier, the one from the seating chart, the one Julian's head table sat directly beneath, its light throwing a soft gold wash over a room full of people who believed, with total sincerity, that they were watching a family at the height of its standing. I found my seat at that head table, between Julian and Richard, and I looked out at the room, and I found, without needing to search hard, 4 faces I now recognized among the catering staff near the kitchen doors, agents in black vests under white service jackets, and 1 face at a table near the back, unremarkable in a rented tuxedo, that belonged to my brother. Cocktail hour passed in the particular blur of a room full of people I'd spent 19 months performing warmth for, Margaret circulating in a champagne-colored gown that had cost, I happened to know from a receipt I'd filed months earlier without quite knowing why I was keeping it, $11,200. Accepting compliments on the flowers, on the quartet, on how well everything came together, while 3 tables away her husband's 42-foot boat sat unpaid for in a marina and, closer still, though she didn't yet know it, her son's federal indictment sat sealed in a folder in an agent's jacket pocket. Vanessa worked the room in a dress I recognized, with the specific eye of someone who had spent 19 months quietly financing this family's rotating debts, as one she'd charged 3 weeks earlier to a card Margaret had told me, in an unguarded moment at a different dinner, was getting a little maxed, but it's fine, it's temporary. At 8:44 p.m., the Historical Society's board chair, a silver-haired man named Douglas Kettering, stepped to the podium and asked the room's attention for the evening's Emerging Leadership Award, and I watched Julian rise from beside me, straighten his jacket, and walk toward the front of the ballroom with the easy, practiced confidence of a man who had never once in his life doubted that a room would applaud when asked to. Douglas read 3 sentences of prepared remarks about Julian's contributions to the North Shore business community and dedication to client relationships, language I recognized, with a specific bitter clarity, as language that could describe either the man everyone in that room believed they were honoring, or the man Daniel's case file described in exhaustive, subpoenaed detail. And then Douglas handed Julian a crystal plaque and the microphone, and Julian, glowing under the chandelier, began the 5 minutes of remarks he'd rehearsed twice in our bathroom mirror over the past week. Remarks that opened with the sentence, "I owe so much of this to my incredible family and to my wife, Elena, whose support has meant everything to me this past year," a sentence that landed in the ballroom as warm, generous, uxorious, and landed in my own chest as the single most accurate sentence he had said to me in 19 months, though not remotely in the way the room understood it. I watched 4 catering staff near the kitchen doors set down their trays. Julian was 30 seconds into a story about learning the value of hard work from his father, when Agent Whitfield and 3 others crossed the ballroom floor, not running, not shouting, moving with the specific unhurried authority of people who had done this, exactly this way, many times before, and reached the podium as Julian's sentence trailed into confusion, his eyes moving from Whitfield's badge to the 3 agents flanking him to, finally, across the ballroom, to me, standing now beside my chair at the head table, having risen without quite deciding to, and I watched something in his face collapse in real time. Not shock exactly, something closer to recognition, the specific recognition of a man realizing that a debt he'd been quietly avoiding for a very long time had finally, publicly, come due. "Julian Ashworth Cole," Whitfield said, his voice pitched to carry to the nearest tables without shouting. "You're under arrest on federal charges of wire fraud, conspiracy to commit wire fraud, and securities fraud. You have the right to remain silent." The room, 400 guests in black tie holding champagne flutes, went through a very specific, very audible sequence of sound. A gasp that started at the tables nearest the podium and rippled outward, a scrape of chairs as people half rose to see better, a single dropped glass that shattered near table 12, and underneath all of it, the string quartet, 3 bars into the next piece before someone finally signaled them to stop, the bow drawing one long, dying note across a cello before silence actually arrived. Margaret reached the front of the room in 11 seconds, I counted them, moving faster than I had ever seen her move in 19 months of watching her perform effortless grace, and she grabbed Whitfield's arm and said, "This is absolutely unacceptable. Do you have any idea who this family is?" And Whitfield, without breaking his procedural rhythm, without raising his voice, said, "Ma'am, I need you to step back," in the specific flat tone of a man who has heard this exact sentence, in this exact register of disbelief, from 100 other families who believed their name was a form of legal immunity. And Margaret stepped back. Not because she chose to, but because Richard, arriving a half-second later, pulled her back by the shoulder, his own face gone the specific gray-white color I recognized from the wedding night, from the moment Corinne Abelman had leaned in to tell her about the declined card, except this was not a $4,000 bar tab. This was everything. I walked to the front of the ballroom myself, not summoned, not performing, simply because I understood, with total clarity, that 19 months of documentation had earned me the right to be standing there when it finally became visible. And Julian, hands now cuffed in front of him, one agent's hand on his shoulder, looked at me across 6 feet of parquet floor and said, quietly, just for me, though half the ballroom strained to hear it anyway, "Elena, what did you do?" And I understood, in that question, the final and most complete confirmation of everything Daniel's case had proven. That even now, even in handcuffs, Julian's first instinct was not "what did I do?" but "what did you do?" As though 19 months of Halcyon Bridge and Isabel Reyes and a margin call funded by 7 strangers' retirement savings were simply background conditions, and I was the variable that had finally, inconveniently, changed. I said, loud enough for the nearest tables to hear, because I had decided, somewhere in those 11 days of planning, that I would say exactly this and nothing more. I traced every dollar you moved through Halcyon Bridge, Julian. I have the wire transfers. I have the apartment on Streeterville. I have the ring. And I watched, over his shoulder, Isabel Reyes, whom I had not known was even on the guest list until that exact moment, standing near a side entrance in a burgundy dress, her hand pressed flat against her mouth, and I understood that Margaret's callback had finally, fully arrived. "She's only here for the money," Margaret had said, 19 months earlier, laughing, certain she was describing me, and I said it now, quietly, only to Julian, only close enough for him to hear. "You were the one who was only ever here for the money, Julian. I was just the only one paying attention." The agents led him out through the side entrance nearest the kitchen, past round tables of frozen, silent guests, past the $95,000 peonies, past Margaret, who had sat down hard in a gilt ballroom chair, her champagne-colored gown pooling around her like something already deflating, past Richard, whose hand had found the back of a chair to steady himself against, past Vanessa, who stood completely still for the first time I had ever witnessed in 5 years, her borrowed dress suddenly looking, in that frozen room, exactly as borrowed as it actually was. Douglas Kettering stood alone at the podium, still holding the crystal emerging leadership plaque no one had thought to take back. And somewhere behind me, my brother crossed the ballroom floor, still in his rented tuxedo, and put a hand on my shoulder and said quietly, "It's done. It's actually done." And I realized, standing in the middle of 400 silent, staring strangers, that I was, for the first time in 19 months, no longer performing anything at all. 14 months have passed since that night at Thornfield, and I want to tell you, specifically and individually, what happened to each person who spent 19 months believing their name. Their status or their proximity to my money entitled them to something they had never actually earned, because the epilogue of a story like this only means something if it's precise, and I have spent my entire career believing that precision is a form of respect, even when the people you're being precise about have earned very little of it. Julian pled guilty, 11 months after his arrest, to wire fraud and securities fraud. In a plea deal Daniel described to me as about as favorable to the government as they come, negotiated down from the original conspiracy and additional securities charges in exchange for full cooperation against Preston Kowalczyk and for agreeing to a restitution order covering the full $1,140,000 in total investor losses, an order that will follow him, per federal restitution law, regardless of bankruptcy filings, for the rest of his working life. He was sentenced to 7 years in federal prison, currently serving that sentence at a low-security facility in Terre Haute, Indiana. A fact I know only because Daniel mentioned it once, briefly, and I have not visited, and do not intend to. Kingsley Hartwell terminated his employment the Monday after his arrest, revoked his securities licenses through FINRA proceedings that will bar him from ever again working in any capacity requiring registration with a securities regulator, which means that whatever Julian Ashworth Cole does with the rest of his professional life, once released, it will not be wealth strategy, and it will not, in any state, ever again involve access to other people's money. Preston Kowalczyk received a longer sentence, 9 years, having been found, through the fuller accounting Daniel's team assembled, to have personally orchestrated the initial fraud structure and to have targeted Kingsley Hartwell clients, specifically because of the credibility Julian's introduction lent the scheme, a detail the sentencing judge noted specifically as an aggravating factor. His Streeterville lease was terminated for non-payment 4 months after his arrest. His Range Rover was repossessed the same week. The last information I have about him, secondhand, through Daniel, is that he is currently appealing a portion of the restitution order from federal prison, an appeal Daniel describes as going nowhere, the way they usually don't. Margaret Ashworth Cole's social standing in Lake Forest, the entire architecture of performed wealth she had spent 3 decades constructing, collapsed within roughly 6 weeks of the gala, not through any additional action of mine, but through the simple, ordinary mechanics of a small, tightly networked community processing a very public event. The Lake Forest Historical Society quietly declined to hold its next annual gala at Thornfield, citing scheduling, a euphemism everyone understood. 3 separate friends Margaret had known for over 20 years stopped returning her calls within the first month, a pattern I learned about not from Margaret, who I have not spoken to since that night, but from Vanessa, who called me 8 months later, in a very different tone than she'd ever used with me before, to tell me, unprompted, that Mom doesn't really leave the house much anymore. Margaret and Richard sold Thornfield 11 months after the gala, at a price that, once the second and third home equity draws were satisfied, left them with, according to public property records I did not have to work particularly hard to find, less than $200,000 in proceeds, a fraction of what the house had once represented, and moved into a 2-bedroom condominium in Deerfield, a town Margaret had once described, at a dinner years earlier, with a specific curled lip, as fine for some people. Richard's insurance brokerage, already hollowed out before any of this began, closed permanently 4 months after the gala, unable to survive both the reputational fallout of his son's federal fraud conviction and a business that had, it turned out once outside accountants finally reviewed the books during the divorce and bankruptcy proceedings that followed, been technically insolvent for close to 3 years, propped up entirely by the same rotating cast of home equity draws, credit lines, and quiet borrowing that had funded the boat, the club membership, and the entire performance of the Ashworth Coal name. Richard, at 66, currently works, according to a LinkedIn update Vanessa mentioned to me, with a kind of flat, exhausted resignation, as an insurance sales associate for a firm he once would have considered beneath him, earning, based on standard industry commission structures for that role, a fraction of what he once claimed, loudly and often, that a man of his standing was owed by the world simply for existing. Vanessa's transformation was the one I found, honestly, hardest to predict and, in its own way, the most human of any of them. In the immediate aftermath, she was furious, calling me twice in the first month with a bitterness I hadn't previously seen from her, accusing me of destroying the family and caring more about being right than about the people who loved you. Conversations I ended calmly, without argument, because I had spent 19 months building a case on facts and had no remaining appetite for arguing about feelings that facts had already settled. But something shifted around month 5, after the Deerfield condominium, after her own consulting business, deprived of the family safety net that had quietly subsidized it for years, finally fully collapsed, and she took, for the first time in her adult life, an actual job. An entry-level marketing coordinator role at a mid-sized firm in the western suburbs, a position I know, because she told me herself in that 8th-month phone call, pays $51,000 a year, a number she said with something I had never once heard in her voice before across 5 years of knowing her, a kind of chastened, genuine pride. She apologized to me on that call, not eloquently, not completely, but genuinely, for all those years of just assuming, and I told her I appreciated it, and I meant it, and it is. Of every relationship that survived the collapse of that family's architecture, the only one I speak to with any regularity now, roughly once a month, and I find, to my own quiet surprise, that I don't entirely mind. Isabel Reyes was terminated from Kingsley Hartwell within a week of the arrest, once it became clear her relationship with Julian would be relevant to internal compliance review, and left Chicago entirely 6 months later, moving, according to a mutual acquaintance from the wedding planning industry who mentioned it to my mother at a completely unrelated event, to Denver, where she reportedly works now in a role unconnected to finance. I never spoke to her directly, not once, across the entire 19 months or in the 14 since, and I have made a specific, deliberate peace with never doing so, because I came to understand, somewhere in the process of building this case, that Isabel was a symptom of Julian's choices, not their architect. And while I don't forgive what she participated in, I also don't carry her the way I carry the others, because she never once claimed a status she hadn't earned, never once looked down a hallway and narrated its provenance to make me feel small. She was simply careless with a married man's attention, which is its own kind of wrong, but a smaller one than the wrongs that actually broke this family. As for me, the divorce was finalized 9 months after the gala, and Priya's 14 months of patient preparation proved, in the end, decisive, because the dissipation of assets claim, covering the Halcyon Bridge losses, the Streeterville apartment, and every documented gift to Isabel, resulted in a settlement that returned to me, in total, $461,000. A number I noticed, with the specific dark humor that 11 years of forensic work eventually teaches you to find in coincidence, corresponded almost exactly to the final cost of our wedding. My firm, Callaway Reyes Analytics, made me full equity partner 8 months ago, not out of sympathy, my managing partner was careful to clarify, but because the caseload I brought in that year, largely referrals from attorneys who'd heard, through the specific grapevine that exists among Chicago's complex litigation community, about the forensic rigor of the Ashworth Coal case, nearly doubled the firm's revenue in family office fraud work. I bought a condominium on my own name, on my own signature, in Lincoln Park, 4 blocks from the one I'd sold to fund a marriage that turned out to be its own kind of shell company. I still keep composition notebooks, the marbled kind, the kind my mother taught me on, not because I need them professionally anymore. Everything I do now runs through proper case management software, but because there is something about writing a number down by hand, watching it become permanent in your own handwriting, that I never want to lose, no matter how far this career takes me. I think often about the specific moment this entire story pivoted on, not the gala, not the arrest, but a much smaller moment. a bathroom stall at the Drake Hotel, 40 minutes before a toast, where a 29-year-old, I was 34 by the gala, but I was 32 on my wedding day. I should say this plainly. Where a woman in a wedding dress made a choice that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with information. The choice to gather proof before she asked a single question out loud. I have thought in the months since about whether I would make that same choice again, whether 19 months of silence was the right price to pay for a case complete enough to survive contact with a courtroom, and I keep arriving at the same answer. I would. Not because patience doesn't cost something, it cost me 19 months of my one life spent inside a lie, but because the alternative, confronting Julian the week I first suspected something, would have gotten me an argument, a denial, a man with enough warning to hide what he'd done, and I would have spent the rest of my life not knowing the actual shape of what had happened to me. I chose knowing. I would choose it again. If there is a lesson in any of this, and I've had 14 months to look for one, it isn't really about money, though money is the language this whole story got told in. It's about the specific, quiet power of refusing to accept a story someone else is telling about you before you've checked whether the numbers actually support it. Margaret told a room full of people I was only there for the money. She said it as a joke, sure of the punchline, certain the room would laugh and move on, and it did, that night. But a punchline only survives if nobody ever goes back and checks the math, and I have spent my entire professional life being exactly the kind of person who goes back and checks the math. So let me ask you the same question I've been asking myself since that bathroom stall. How many stories has somebody told about you? Certain you'd never check, certain the room would just laugh and move on. And what would happen if, just once, you decided to trace every single line of it yourself? There is one more piece of this I haven't told you yet, because it happened only 6 weeks ago, and because I think it belongs at the very end, after everything else. The way the last page of a ledger sometimes holds the entry that finally makes the whole year make sense. I was at my desk at Callaway Reyes Analytics on a Tuesday afternoon in March, reviewing a client file completely unrelated to any of this, a mid-sized manufacturing company suspicious of its own CFO, when my assistant buzzed to say a woman named Margaret Ashworth Cole was in the lobby, without an appointment, asking to see me. I want to describe exactly what she looked like, because the woman who walked into my office 14 months after that ballroom, 20 months after a toast at my own wedding, was not the woman who had narrated a Chippendales provenance to me in a Sheridan Road hallway 6 years earlier. She was wearing a coat I recognized as several seasons old, expensive once but visibly worn at the cuffs, no longer tanned the specific Boca Raton bronze she'd maintained for as long as I'd known her. Her silver blonde hair grown out an inch at the roots in a way the old Margaret would never have permitted a photograph of. She sat across from me in the chair I usually reserve for clients disclosing exactly the kind of financial catastrophe I had once quietly built a case around inside her own family, and for a long moment she didn't say anything at all, just looked around my office, at the framed diplomas, at the view of the river, I noticed her eyes catch and hold for a second, a small brass nameplate on my desk that read, Elena Marchetti, partner, no longer carrying the Ashworth Cole name at all. A detail I hadn't consciously arranged for her benefit, but which I will admit, watching her register it, I did not regret. I need help, she said finally, with something financial. I know it's strange coming to you, of all people, but you're the best in the city at this. Everyone says so now, and I don't have anyone else who would actually tell me the truth. She explained, in a voice with none of its old imperial certainty, that a financial advisor Richard had found through the insurance firm he now worked entry-level commission at had approached them, in the wreckage of the divorce and bankruptcy and the sale of Thornfield, about consolidating the small remainder of their retirement accounts into a new opportunity, an investment fund with returns that sounded, to Margaret's own description, honestly almost too good, a phrase that landed in my chest with a very specific, very cold recognition, because I had heard some version of that exact sentence once before, from my own mouth, describing Halcyon Bridge to Daniel over the phone at 11:45 at night 4 years ago. I did not say I told you so. I want you to know that, because I thought about it, sitting across from her, thought about every dinner where she'd called my career numbers work, every hallway where she'd assessed me like collateral, every joke at my own wedding that had turned 211 guests into an audience for my humiliation, and I found, when the moment actually arrived, that I didn't want it. I asked her for the paperwork. She had brought it in a manila folder, hands slightly unsteady as she passed it across my desk, and I spent 40 minutes reading it in front of her, the same 40 minutes of silence she had once made me sit through while she narrated her own family's provenance. Except this time, the silence was mine to hold, and I held it the way I hold every silence now. Patiently, precisely, gathering everything before I said a single word. It was, as I'd suspected from the first paragraph, a fraud, cruder and smaller than Halcyon Bridge, but built from the exact same architecture. A shell entity, a manager with no verifiable track record, a document requesting Margaret and Richard's remaining $91,000 in liquid retirement assets, the literal last of what Thornfield's sale had left them, wired within 5 business days to secure the current rate. I told her plainly what it was, walked her through the incorporation record I pulled up in front of her in real time, the same $25 public search I'd run on Halcyon Bridge years earlier, showed her the registered agent, the absence of any SEC filing, the manager's LinkedIn page with a philosophy degree and no finance credentials, an almost eerie echo of Preston Kowalczyk that I don't think she consciously registered, and I watched her face do something I had genuinely never once seen it do in 6 years of knowing her. It simply, completely, without performance, crumpled. "I don't have anything left if this is gone too," she said, and I understood in that sentence that I was looking at the actual, undecorated shape of a woman I had spent 6 years only ever seeing through the armor of her own performance, a woman whose entire identity had been built on a foundation that had been quietly rotting for longer than either of us had known, and who now, at 63, was sitting in the office of the daughter-in-law she'd once dismissed in front of 211 wedding guests, asking that same daughter-in-law, with nothing left to trade, nothing left to perform, simply to help her not lose the last of it. I told her not to send the money. I told her I would have my paralegal draft a formal letter to the Fraud Division of the Illinois Secretary of State's office on her behalf, the exact office I'd used to unravel Halcyon Bridge, and that I would not charge her for the hour of consultation. And she started to cry. Not the practiced, camera-ready tears I imagined she'd deployed at charity functions over the decades, but the specific, ugly, unguarded crying of someone whose last illusion had just been taken away by the one person she'd least expected to be the one to take it kindly. She said, "Through it, I don't know why you're helping me," and I told her the truth, the only truth that has ever actually mattered across this entire story. Because I only ever wanted to know what was actually real. I never wanted anyone to lose everything over it. I just refused to keep pretending I didn't see it. She left my office 40 minutes later, folder in hand, a formal complaint drafted and ready to file, and I sat alone at my desk for a long time afterward, looking out at the river, thinking about the specific, strange symmetry of it, that the same forensic instinct that had once dismantled her son's entire fabricated life had, years later, in the exact same conference room chair, been the only thing standing between her and losing what little remained of her own. I don't know if I'll hear from her again. I don't know if Vanessa's slow, chastened rebuilding of an honest life will hold, or whether Richard will ever stop describing his current commission-based job in the same tone he once used for the family insurance brokerage he ran into the ground. I don't know if Julian, 3 years and some months from a release date I've deliberately never let myself calculate too precisely, will try to contact me when he's out, or what I'll do if he does. What I know is this: I am sitting in my own office, under my own name, with my own composition notebook open on the desk beside a laptop running case management software that didn't exist when my mother first taught me to add a column of numbers. And somewhere in Terre Haute, Indiana, a man who once stood under a chandelier and thanked a room for celebrating him is finding out, in exactly the slow, grinding, undramatic way institutions actually work, precisely how long 7 years feels when you're the one finally being counted instead of doing the counting. My phone buzzed on my desk as I was locking up that evening 6 weeks ago, a text from an unknown number with a Terre Haute area code, 3 words long, the first contact of any kind since the ballroom, "I still love," and then nothing else. The message cut off exactly there. Whether by his own hesitation or a prison phone system's character limit, I will genuinely never know. And I stood in my own office, in the dark, holding a phone with 3 unfinished words glowing on the screen, and felt, for the first time in 14 months, the specific vertigo I thought I'd finally filed away for good, and I have not, as of tonight, answered it. I want to go back, before I tell you what I did with that text message, and fill in a piece of that ballroom night I skipped over, because I've been asked, in the months since, by people who somehow heard fragments of this story secondhand, what it actually felt like in the specific 60 seconds between Julian's arrest and the moment my brother crossed the floor to put a hand on my shoulder. And I've never fully answered that, even to myself. So let me try now, with the same precision I bring to everything else. The room did not go silent all at once. It went silent in layers, the way a wave doesn't arrive as a single wall of water, but as a series of smaller collapses that only look, from a distance, like one continuous event. First the tables nearest the podium, then the middle of the room, then, last of all, a cluster of guests near the bar who hadn't yet turned to look, and kept talking for a full 4 or 5 seconds after everyone else had stopped. Their laughter landing, grotesquely, in the exact silence it was no longer welcome in, before someone beside them grabbed an arm and hissed something, and that laughter died too, mid-syllable. I remember the specific smell of the room, in that moment, with a clarity I've never had for any other memory in my life. White peonies, hot candle wax, spilled champagne from the glass that had shattered near table 12, and underneath it, faintly, the particular ozone smell of the caterers' chafing dishes still running on their warmers, utterly indifferent to what was happening 20 feet away. I remember Douglas Kettering, the Historical Society's board chair, still holding that crystal plaque, turning it over once in his hands as though checking whether it had suddenly become evidence of something, before setting it down on the podium with a small, precise click that somehow carried across the entire frozen ballroom. I remember a woman at the second table, someone I'd been introduced to once, years earlier, whose name I never retained, whispering to her husband, not quietly enough, I knew something was off with that family. A sentence I understood, even in that moment, would become the official retroactive consensus of North Shore Society within about 72 hours, everyone suddenly certain, in hindsight, that they had always seen it coming, the same way people are always certain, after a stock collapses, that they'd had a bad feeling about it all along. What I did not expect, and what I think about more than almost anything else from that night, was the specific expression on my own mother's face when I found her afterward in the parking valet line, because my parents had come, of course, invited months earlier as Julian's in-laws before any of this began, and my mother, Renata, who had cried in a car after paying for an engagement dinner she'd been ambushed into covering, who had spent 30 years keeping other people's books in composition notebooks and never once let a number get past her, looked at me across that valet line not with shock, not with pity, but with something that took me a moment to place because I had so rarely seen it aimed at me specifically. Pure, uncomplicated pride. The kind you'd give a daughter who had finally, after a very long silence, told the truth out loud in a room that badly needed to hear it. She didn't say anything at first, she just took my face in both hands, the way she used to when I was small, and had done something that scared her a little with how well I'd done it, and said, "Your grandmother would have loved you for this," which is, of everything anyone said to me that entire year, the sentence I have returned to most often since. My father found us a moment later, still in his good suit, the same one he'd worn to the wedding 20 months earlier, and he didn't say anything at all, just put one hand on my shoulder, briefly, the way he does when words feel insufficient to him, which is often, because my father has always trusted numbers more than sentences, and I understood that gesture as its own kind of complete statement. We drove home together that night, the three of us in my father's car, because I'd arrived with Julian and had no intention of ever sitting in that particular passenger seat again, and nobody spoke for most of the ride, the radio off, the city lights sliding past the windows, and somewhere around Fullerton Avenue, my mother finally said, quietly, into the dark, "How long have you known?" And I told her the truth. 19 months, almost to the week, and she was quiet again for a long time. And then she said the thing I think explains, more than anything else in this entire story, where I actually learned to do what I did. I would have done exactly the same thing, she said. Get everything first. Feel it after. I want to tell you too about the specific week that followed the gala, because the epilogue I gave you earlier compresses 14 months into a series of outcomes. And outcomes are clean in a way that the actual living of those 14 months never once was. The Monday after the arrest, I went to work as though nothing had happened, because Priya had advised me, correctly, that maintaining total normalcy in my professional conduct mattered enormously for how the divorce proceedings and the parallel federal case would eventually be perceived. And I sat through a 9 a.m. client call about inventory discrepancies at a auto parts distributor with my hands perfectly steady on my keyboard, while 3 floors below me, in the lobby, a photographer from a business publication that covers white-collar crime in Chicago was apparently trying, unsuccessfully, to get someone at my firm's front desk to confirm whether I was the wife from the Ashworth Cole case, a phrase I heard used about myself, secondhand, for the first time that week, and which still, honestly, sits strangely on me, because I have never once thought of what happened as belonging to Julian's name. I think of it as belonging to mine. The federal prosecutor assigned to the case, a woman named Assistant U.S. Attorney Diane Okafor, met with me twice in the 2 weeks following the arrest. Once to review my documentation for admissibility, once simply, I came to understand, to check in on how I was actually doing. A kindness I hadn't expected from someone whose entire professional relationship to me was as a witness in a case file. She told me in that second meeting something I've held on to since, that in 6 years of prosecuting affinity fraud and financial crimes, she had seen exactly 2 other cases where a victim had independently built documentation this thorough before law enforcement ever got involved. And both times, she said, the victim had been someone with professional training almost identical to mine, someone whose career had accidentally prepared them, years in advance, for the worst night of their personal life. Most people don't get the chance to be this ready, she told me. You didn't get a chance. You built one. I think it's worth telling you about the other 6 people Halcyon Bridge defrauded, because I've mostly told you this story from inside my own kitchen table and my own marriage, and it would be dishonest to let you leave thinking this was only ever about me. There was a couple in Winnetka, the Halversons, both in their late 60s, who had moved $211,000 of retirement savings into Halcyon Bridge on Julian's specific recommendation, 8 months before I even started tracing the account. Money they'd intended to use to help their daughter with a down payment on her first house. Money that was gone entirely by the time the federal case recovered what it could. Restitution that, per federal sentencing guidelines, would take Julian and Preston years, possibly decades, to fully repay, if they ever did at all. There was a widower named Thomas Ferreira, 71, a former Kingsley Hartwell client of Julian's for over a decade, who had put in the largest single individual amount, $406,000, nearly his entire life insurance payout from his wife's death 2 years earlier. Trusting Julian specifically because Julian had personally, sensitively, helped him navigate that payout at the worst moment of his life. A betrayal I found, reading Agent Whitfield's victim impact summary during the sentencing phase, harder to sit with than almost anything that had happened to me directly, because at least I had gone into this marriage with my eyes eventually opening. Thomas Ferreira had simply trusted a man who was supposed to be protecting a grieving widower's last resources, and used that trust as raw material for a fraud. I met Thomas once, in person, at the sentencing hearing 11 months after the arrest, in a federal courtroom on Dearborn Street, both of us there as victims entitled to give impact statements. And I remember him finding me in the hallway afterward, a small, careful man in a cardigan that looked like it had been pressed specifically for this occasion, and he shook my hand and said, "I heard it was your work that finally caught this." And I said something modest, and he said, "My wife kept books too, you know. Small business, nothing like yours, but she never let a penny get past her either." And I understood, standing in that marble hallway, that I had just been quietly, briefly, welcomed into a fellowship I hadn't known existed. Women, mostly, some men too, who keep the numbers honest in families and businesses that would otherwise drift, and who are so often dismissed for it. Called numbers work, called a household utility, until the exact moment the numbers are the only thing standing between everyone they love and total collapse. I gave my own victim impact statement that day, 4 minutes long, which I had drafted and redrafted 11 times in the weeks before, cutting it shorter each time because I found that the shortest version was also the most true. I did not talk about the money, not primarily, though I mentioned the figure once, for the record. I talked instead about the specific discipline of living inside a marriage for 19 months knowing it was already over, about what it costs a person to hold that knowledge alone, silently, for the sake of a case that mattered to more people than just herself. And I looked directly at Julian while I said it, seated at the defense table in a gray suit that no longer fit him quite the way his tailored suits once had. Prison intake having already begun its slow, unglamorous work on a man who had spent his whole life being told his body, like everything else about him, deserved attention and accommodation. He did not look back at me. He looked at the table the entire 4 minutes, and I have thought, often, about whether that was shame or simply strategy. His attorney's advice to appear contrite rather than defiant, and I have decided, in the end, that it doesn't matter which it was, because either way, the sentence landed the same. Frank Oyalaran, the private investigator, sent me a card 6 weeks after the sentencing, an actual paper card, which surprised me, because everything else about our professional relationship had been conducted by email and invoice. Inside, in handwriting that reminded me a little of my mother's composition notebooks, he'd written, 22 years on the force, 11 years doing this, and I've never seen a case built this clean by someone doing it in her spare time after a full workday. You'd have made a hell of a detective. Glad I got to help. I keep that card in the same drawer where I once kept the folder labeled Tax Documents 2019, which now holds nothing but old tax returns, exactly what the label always claimed, because I no longer need to hide anything inside my own home, a fact that still occasionally strikes me, at odd moments with a kind of quiet astonishment, that ordinary honesty, the simple absence of a second, secret ledger running underneath my real life, is not something I take for granted anymore. I know now, with total certainty, what it costs to live without it. Daniel and I have never fully talked in any depth about what it cost him personally to run an investigation into his own brother-in-law for 11 months while sitting across from him at family dinners, laughing at his jokes, watching him carve a turkey at Thanksgiving, 4 months before the arrest. And I suspect we never will fully talk about it, because that is also how our family operates, more through gesture and shared understanding than through extended emotional conversation. But he did say one thing to me. At Christmas, 7 weeks after the sentencing, standing in our mother's kitchen while she finished dinner, that I think about often. He said, "You know, the hardest part for me wasn't the investigation. It was watching you cook him dinner every single week for almost a year and a half, knowing what I knew, and not being able to say a single word to protect you from it, because saying anything would have destroyed the case." I told him I understood, that it had been my choice, that he'd only ever done what I asked him to. He said, "I know, doesn't mean it was easy to watch." And then he went back to setting the table, because that is also how our family says the things that matter most. Briefly, and then immediately followed by something practical, as though the practical thing were the point all along. And maybe, in a family like mine, it always has been. Priya Chandrasekaran, my divorce attorney, still sends me a card every October, around the anniversary of the wedding, not out of any sentimentality. She'd be the first to tell you sentimentality has never once won her a case. But because, she told me once, you were the client that reminded me why I actually do this work. A line I've thought about often, because I think what she meant, underneath the compliment, was something closer to relief. That in 18 years of representing people at the worst moment of their financial and personal lives, it is rare, genuinely rare, to represent someone who arrives already knowing exactly what happened to her, who has already done the hardest part of the work herself, and who needs a lawyer not to convince a judge of the truth, but simply to translate a truth that was already, meticulously, completely proven. I've been asked by the 2 or 3 friends who know the full version of this story rather than the version that eventually made its way, in fragments and exaggerations, through the North Shore social circuit, whether I regret marrying Julian at all, whether, knowing everything I know now, I would go back and refuse him in that kitchen on Astor Street, the night he proposed with a ring he couldn't actually afford. I've thought about this question more than any other question in this entire story, and my honest answer surprises even me sometimes. I don't think I regret it, not because the marriage was good, it clearly, catastrophically was not, but because I don't think I would have become quite this version of myself without living through it. I was, before Julian, a very good forensic accountant who had never once had to apply that skill to protect her own life. I am, after Julian, something slightly different. A woman who knows, with absolute, tested certainty, exactly what she is capable of when the stakes are no longer someone else's client file, but her own future. Let me tell you about the specific mechanics of how I actually rebuilt a life in the 14 months since the gala. Because I think the part of this story people find hardest to believe isn't the fraud, or the affair, or even the arrest at the podium. It's the ordinary, unglamorous work of what comes after. The part no one photographs for a society page. The first 3 months after the arrest, I lived, briefly, back in my parents' 2-flat in Cicero, in my childhood bedroom, which my mother had converted into a sewing room a decade earlier, but which still had, tucked in the closet, a box of my old University of Illinois textbooks she'd never had the heart to throw away, and there was something both humbling and strangely grounding about falling asleep. At 33 years old, 6 inches from a shelf of undergraduate accounting textbooks that had once represented the entire horizon of my ambition, now light years behind everything I'd since built and lost and was in the process of rebuilding. I went back to work exactly 9 days after the arrest, against the gentle advice of nearly everyone who loved me, because I had learned, across 19 months of forensic discipline, that work was not an escape from what had happened to me. It was the one place where the version of myself that had actually solved this entire case was still fully, reliably intact. My managing partner, a woman named Judith Calloway, who founded the firm 22 years ago, after leaving a Big Four accounting firm that had, in her words, never once let a woman make partner before 50, called me into her office my first week back and said, without preamble, I read the case file. Off the record, obviously, none of it through firm channels. I want you to know that what you built is some of the cleanest independent forensic work I've seen in this city in a decade. And I want you thinking about what a full partnership track looks like for you. Starting now, not in 3 years, now. I cried in her office, the first time I'd cried in front of anyone at work in 11 years there, and she let me, without comment, and then handed me a tissue and a new client file and said, "Grief and excellence aren't mutually exclusive. Go prove it." Which became, in its own quiet way, the sentence I built the rest of that year around. The financial rebuilding took longer than the professional rebuilding, in some ways, because untangling 19 months of commingled finances from a man under federal indictment is its own specific bureaucratic nightmare, involving forensic accountants, which is to say, involving people doing to my own finances exactly the kind of work I do for clients every day, an experience that gave me, I'll admit, a new and sometimes uncomfortable empathy for how vulnerable it feels to have someone else's trained eyes moving through your bank statements, looking for the places where the story doesn't quite add up. Priya's team worked alongside my own firm's compliance department for 4 months to fully reconstruct which assets were legitimately mine, which were commingled, and which needed to be clawed back through the dissipation claim, a process that required me to produce 11 years of my own financial history, tax returns back to my first year out of college, documentation of the Lincoln Park condo sale, every dollar I'd ever earned laid out in a spreadsheet not unlike the ones I build for clients. Except this time, the client's whole life was mine. I want to be honest about the parts of that year that had nothing to do with Triumph, because I think stories like this one sometimes flatten the recovery into something too clean. And 14 months of actual healing was not clean. There were nights, more than I expected, more than I like admitting even now, when I woke at 3 in the morning with my heart going too fast. Not from any specific nightmare I could point to, just a residual current still running through my body from 19 months of vigilance that didn't switch off the moment the vigilance was no longer necessary. I started seeing a therapist, a woman named Dr. Renene Okonkwo Fields, 6 weeks after the arrest. Initially, I told her in our first session, just to make sure I'm processing this correctly, a sentence she gently pointed out in roughly our third session, was itself a symptom. The idea that grief needed to be optimized and correctly executed, rather than simply, messily, survived. I still see her every other week. I probably will for a while longer. I don't think that's a failure of my own competence, the way some part of me initially did. I think it's the same discipline that built the Halcyon Bridge case applied. Finally, to the one ledger I'd spent 19 months refusing to fully audit, my own interior life. I want to tell you too about a specific evening about 5 months after the arrest, because I think it's the moment that actually marks, more than any court date or professional milestone, the point where I started to feel like the ground under me was solid again, rather than something I was still forensically reconstructing in real time. I was at my new condo in Lincoln Park, the one bought entirely under my own name, unpacking the last of maybe 40 boxes, most of them books, and I found, at the bottom of one box, a composition notebook of my own, not my mother's, one I'd apparently kept during my very first year out of college, filled with practice ledgers I'd built for imaginary small businesses as part of my own self-directed study. 22 years old and already, even then, drilling myself on how to spot an inconsistency 3 rows before I could name it. I sat on the floor of my half-unpacked living room for over an hour reading my own handwriting from 12 years earlier, and I remember thinking, with a clarity that felt almost physical, that the woman who wrote those practice ledgers at 22 had no idea, could not possibly have known, that the exact skill she was quietly building for a career would one day be the thing that saved her own life. And I sat there and I cried. Finally. Properly, not the composed tears of a courtroom or an office, just the full, unguarded kind. For close to 20 minutes, and then I got up, made myself tea, and kept unpacking. Because that's also something I've learned this year. Grief doesn't require you to stop functioning. It just requires you to let it move through you honestly when it arrives, instead of filing it away for later the way I'd trained myself to do for 19 straight months. I've started dating again, cautiously. In the last 4 months, nothing serious yet, though there is a man, a structural engineer named Theo Bakalis, I met through a mutual friend at Judith's holiday party, who has, so far, in 3 dates, done exactly one thing that has made me pay closer attention than I expected to. On our second date, over dinner, he asked me a direct, specific question about my work. Not the vague, "So, tell me about your job," most people ask, but walk me through how you'd actually find a discrepancy in a set of books. Like, mechanically, what are you looking for first? And he listened to the entire 15-minute answer with genuine attention, asked 2 follow-up questions that showed he'd actually understood the first answer, and never once, across 3 dates, referred to what I do as numbers work. I don't know yet what this relationship will become, or whether it will become anything at all, and I've told myself, with the same discipline I bring to every open case, that I don't need to know yet, that some things are allowed to simply develop without a fully built forensic case proving their outcome in advance. It is, for someone who spent 19 months building exactly that kind of airtight case around her own marriage, a strange and not entirely comfortable kind of freedom, to let something stay genuinely uncertain. There's a specific detail from the sentencing hearing I haven't told you yet, one I've been circling around because it's the piece that still, 14 months later, catches in my chest, in a way none of the financial devastation ever quite managed to. When the judge asked Julian, per standard procedure, whether he had anything he wanted to say before sentencing was formally pronounced, he stood, in that gray suit that no longer fit him, and gave a statement that ran almost 6 minutes, most of it addressed, technically, to the court, to the victims present, to his own family scattered through the gallery in various states of visible collapse. But at the very end, he turned, deliberately, and looked directly at me for the first time since the ballroom, and said, "Elena, I know I don't get to ask for anything from you anymore, and I'm not asking. But I want the record to show that some of what we had was real. I know that doesn't undo any of the rest of it. I just needed to say it out loud, once, before this room decides everything else about who I am." I did not respond, because there was no mechanism in that courtroom for me to respond, no moment built into federal sentencing procedure for the wife of the defendant to answer a statement like that in real time, and I have thought, in the 14 months since, about what I would have said if there had been. I think, honestly, I would have said, some of it probably was real, Julian. That's what made it so effective. A lie built entirely from nothing collapses the first time anyone looks closely at it. The lies that survive 19 months of forensic scrutiny are the ones with real love folded into them somewhere. Real tenderness, real Sunday mornings. Because that realness is exactly what keeps the person on the other end of it from looking too closely, for exactly as long as you need them not to. I don't think that makes what was real less real. I think it makes it more dangerous. And I have had to make peace, slowly, with holding both of those facts at once. That he loved me, in whatever limited, compromised, self-serving way he was capable of loving anyone, and that the love never once stopped him from doing any of it. I want to circle back, to that unfinished text message, the one from the Terre Haute area code, 3 words and a dash, "I still love," because I promised I'd tell you what I did with it, and I think it belongs here, near the very end, because it's the most recent thing that's happened in this entire story, 6 weeks old as I'm telling you this. I sat with that message for 4 days before I did anything at all, not agonizing exactly, more sitting with it the way you'd sit with a client file you weren't ready to open yet, letting the fact of it exist without immediately needing to resolve it. On the 5th day, I typed a response, deleted it, typed a different one, deleted that too, 4 separate times, before I finally settled on the version I actually sent. 6 words, no more. I know, it's not enough. And then I blocked the number. I don't tell you that as a triumphant mic drop, though I understand it might read that way, delivered here at the climax of an epilogue. I tell you because it's true, and because the actual feeling in my chest when I hit send wasn't triumph at all. It was something quieter and more complicated. Something closer to a door closing gently rather than slamming. The specific, undramatic finality of a woman who had already done all her dramatic work 18 months earlier, under a chandelier, in front of 400 witnesses, and had nothing left to prove to anyone, least of all to the man who'd sent it. I blocked the number, put the phone face down on my kitchen counter, the same counter where I once photographed his lock screen from across a room, and I made dinner, alone, for one, in the kitchen of a home he has never once set foot in and never will, and I ate it slowly, and I did not think about him again for the rest of that night, which is, I've come to understand, the actual finish line in a story like this one. Not the arrest, not the divorce decree, just an ordinary Tuesday evening where a man who once tried to take everything from you, finally, completely, fails to occupy any further space in your thoughts. My mother asked me last week over Sunday dinner in Cicero, the same kitchen table where Daniel and I both learned to read a balance sheet before we learned to drive, whether I'd told anyone the full version of this story yet, the real one, not the fragments that made it into the North Shore gossip circuit or the two-paragraph mention in that business publication's white-collar crime roundup. I told her no, not really, not from beginning to end, and she said, in the specific tone she uses when she's not really asking a question, she's handing you an assignment, you should. Not for them, for the version of yourself who was sitting alone at a kitchen table at midnight for 19 months with nobody to tell. She earned an audience eventually. I've thought about that sentence more than almost anything else she's ever said to me, and I think it's the actual reason I'm telling you all of this now, sitting where I'm sitting, with everything finally settled into the shape it's going to hold. 6 weeks ago, the same week the unfinished text message arrived, I got a call from Judith, my managing partner, telling me the firm had just been retained by a new client, a family office managing generational wealth for a fourth-generation Chicago manufacturing family, who had specifically requested me, by name, after a referral from Assistant U.S. Attorney Diane Okafor's office, because the family's youngest son-in-law had recently taken over management of a portion of the family trust, and something in his quarterly reporting wasn't reconciling the way it should. Judith told me the case, in her assessment, smells a lot like your case, and asked whether I wanted it, whether it felt like too much, too soon, too close to something I'd only just started to put down. I told her I wanted it. I told her, in fact, I wanted every case like it that ever came through this firm's doors from now on, because I had learned something in the last 2 years that I don't think I could have learned any other way, that the specific instinct that once nearly cost me everything, the refusal to accept a story simply because everyone around me had already agreed to believe it, is not a wound. It is the most valuable thing I own. I opened the new client's file on my laptop that same evening, at my own kitchen table, in my own condo, under my own name, and I felt, for the first time in longer than I can honestly account for, something that wasn't grief, wasn't vigilance, wasn't the specific cold discipline of building a case in silence. It felt, simply, like coming home to exactly the work I was always going to end up doing, whether Julian Ashworth Cole had ever walked into my life or not. I opened that new client file at 8:14 that evening, and the first page of the Trust's quarterly disbursement report was already showing me something familiar. A pattern I'd trained myself to recognize, the way some people recognize a face across a crowded room. A line item labeled Advisory Services Related Party, $41,000, paid quarterly, to an entity I didn't recognize, incorporated, according to the 15-minute search I ran before I'd even finished my tea, 11 months earlier, registered agent in Springfield, the same flat-fee corporate services company that had once registered Halcyon Bridge Capital Partners LLC for Preston Kowalczyk. I sat back in my chair, alone in my kitchen, and felt the specific, familiar click of recognition settle into my chest. Not dread exactly, something closer to readiness. The particular calm of a person who has done this exact work before and knows, cell by cell, spreadsheet by spreadsheet, precisely how to take it apart. I called Judith the next morning and told her I'd found something in the first 10 minutes that would need a formal engagement letter and, likely, outside counsel sooner rather than later. And she asked me, half joking, half not, whether I ever got tired of being right about people faster than anyone wanted her to be, and I told her the truth. I don't know how to stop noticing what I notice. I never have. It's the thing that nearly broke me and the thing that saved me. In the same 19 months, sometimes in the same afternoon, and I've stopped trying to separate those two facts from each other, because I don't think they were ever actually separate to begin with. The son-in-law in question, I would learn over the following weeks, had a name I won't share here because the case is still active. A smile I recognized instantly from 100 family dinners I never actually attended but somehow already knew by heart, and a wife, 29 years old, the family's youngest daughter, who had no idea yet, sitting at her own family's holiday table this year, exactly how much I was about to find, or how completely her own quiet, private reckoning was about to begin. The same way mine did, in a bathroom stall, in a wedding dress, 40 minutes before a toast that was supposed to be a joke. I finished reviewing the file at 11 that night, the same hour I used to sit at this exact table building the Halcyon Bridge timeline in secret. Except this time there was no secrecy in it at all. No man sleeping upstairs unaware of what I was documenting about him. Just me, a laptop, a mug of cold tea, and a case file with my own name printed clean and legal at the top of every page. And I remember closing the laptop that night and sitting for a moment in the quiet of my own kitchen, in my own home, under my own name, and thinking about Margaret's toast one final time. The way I've thought about it, off and on, for 2 years now, and understanding, finally, completely, what that toast had actually been. Not an insult that broke something in me, but the very first entry in a ledger I didn't yet know I'd started keeping, the opening line of a case I would spend the next 19 months building, alone, patient, exact, until the night a chandelier lit up a ballroom and every single number finally, publicly, came due. I should tell you the rest of what happened with that new case, because it started 6 weeks ago as a quiet suspicion over a single line item, and by the time I'm telling you this, it has already grown into something larger than I initially expected, in exactly the way Halcyon Bridge once did, one thread pulling 3 more loose behind it. The registered agent in Springfield, once I dug past the surface, turned out to have processed formation paperwork for 6 other shell entities over the past 3 years, all incorporated within 11 days of each other, all sharing a single registered office address that turned out, on a public records search that took me under an hour, to be a UPS store mailbox on the north side of the city, the exact kind of red flag I had learned 2 years earlier, entirely on my own, entirely at my own kitchen table, entirely without anyone teaching me, to treat not as a curiosity but as a starting point. I brought what I'd found to Judith on a Thursday morning, laid it out across the conference room table the way I've now done for 11 separate clients since making partner, and she looked at the pattern for maybe 90 seconds before she said, "You know this is going to be bigger than the family's asking, right? This isn't one son-in-law skimming off a trust. This looks like a structure." I told her I already knew. I'd known within the first 10 minutes, the same way I'd known within the first 10 minutes with Halcyon Bridge, the same instinct that had once cost me a marriage and, I've come to understand fully, only in the last several months, given me back a version of my own life I don't think I would have ever found any other way. Judith asked whether I wanted to bring in outside counsel immediately or spend another week building the internal case first. The same question, almost verbatim, that I once had to answer for myself, alone, with no firm behind me, no Judith across a conference table, just a kitchen table and a laptop and a marriage I was quietly, systematically taking apart from the inside. I told her a week. I wanted a week to be thorough, to be certain, to build something that wouldn't crack the first time a defense attorney looked at it sideways, because that is the one lesson from all of this I will never unlearn, no matter how many cases I eventually build in this office instead of at my own kitchen table at midnight. An incomplete case is just an accusation, and an accusation, however true, gives the person you're accusing exactly enough warning to disappear before the truth ever gets to matter. I spent that week the way I now spend most weeks, methodically, precisely, one confirmed detail at a time, and on the Friday afternoon I finished, I sat back in my chair in an office with my own name on the door and felt something settle in my chest that I recognize now as simply, finally, competence without cost, the specific, hard-won feeling of doing the exact work that once broke my heart and finding that it no longer breaks anything at all. It just works. It has always just worked. I only had to survive learning that the hard way once. I think about the 29-year-old daughter in that family sometimes, the one who has no idea yet what I've found, the one who will, in the coming weeks, have her own version of the moment I had in that bathroom stall at the Drake Hotel, the moment where a life you thought you understood turns out to have an entire second architecture running underneath it that nobody thought to show you. I don't know her, not really, not yet, but I know the specific shape of what's coming for her, and I find, sitting here now, that I want her to have exactly what I eventually built for myself. Not vengeance, though I understand now that vengeance and justice can sometimes look identical from certain angles, but simply, finally, the truth. Complete, documented, and undeniable, delivered to her whole and in one piece instead of in the slow, agonizing fragments most people are forced to discover it in. That is, I've realized, somewhere in these last 2 years, what I actually do for a living now, underneath the spreadsheets and the wire transfer traces and the shell company registrations. I give people back the truth of their own lives, fully assembled, so they never again have to stand at their own wedding, smiling, saying nothing, while someone they trusted quietly decides how much of their future they're allowed to keep. Friday evening, after I closed that file, Judith stopped by my office on her way out, coat already on, and asked if I wanted to grab a drink to celebrate closing out the internal review before the outside counsel handoff on Monday, a small ritual we'd started doing after big cases, and I told her yes. And we ended up at a bar 2 blocks from the office, the kind of unremarkable, warmly lit place with good bourbon and bad lighting that has become, over the last year, something like my actual home base for decompressing after a case reaches the point where someone else has to carry it forward. Judith asked me over her second old-fashioned, a question nobody had quite asked me so directly before, whether I ever worried that I'd built an entire career, an entire new identity, on top of the worst thing that ever happened to me, whether there was a version of Elena who existed before Halcyon Bridge that I'd lost access to permanently, replaced now by a woman defined entirely by what she'd survived. I thought about that question longer than I've thought about most questions anyone's asked me in the last 2 years, because it's the one that actually scares me a little, if I'm honest. The possibility that I've turned an act of survival into the entire architecture of who I am, the way the Ashworth Coles once turned a performance of wealth into the entire architecture of who they were, a comparison that unsettled me the moment I made it, sitting there with a glass of bourbon going warm in my hand. But I don't think that's actually what happened, and here's why. The 22-year-old who filled a composition notebook with practice ledgers for imaginary companies existed years before Julian Ashworth Cole ever walked toward me at a dessert table under a chandelier at the Lyric Opera Gala. The instinct to notice, to document, to refuse a story simply because everyone around me had already agreed to believe it. That wasn't something Halcyon Bridge built in me. It was something Halcyon Bridge finally, fully tested, at a scale nothing else in my life ever had, and I passed the test, and passing it didn't create a new person. It just showed me, with more clarity than I'd ever had before, exactly who I'd already spent 32 years quietly becoming. I told Judith some version of that answer, less articulate in the moment, more bourbon-warmed and honest than I'm managing to be telling it to you now, and she nodded slowly and said, "That's the right answer. I've watched people build identities entirely out of their worst year, and it never actually holds. Not long-term. What you're describing sounds like something that's going to hold." We sat in that bar for another hour, talking about nothing in particular, the new client's shell company structure, a case Judith was handling for an unrelated manufacturing dispute, whether the bar's bourbon selection had gotten better or worse since the ownership changed hands last spring, ordinary conversation, the specific unremarkable texture of an ordinary Friday evening that I don't think I fully appreciated the value of until I'd spent 19 months without very many ordinary evenings at all. I walked home afterward, the 2 miles from the bar to my condo, because it was a mild evening and I wanted the time to think, past the specific stretch of Lincoln Park where, 4 years ago now, I used to walk with Julian on Sunday afternoons, past a coffee shop where we'd once spent an entire morning arguing, affectionately, about whether pineapple belonged on pizza, a memory that used to catch in my throat every time I passed that particular corner, and which, walking past it that Friday evening, simply didn't, for the first time, catch at all. I noticed the absence of the catch before I noticed anything else about the walk, and I stood on that corner for a moment, testing it, the way you test a bruise to see if it still hurts, and found, to my genuine surprise, that it didn't. Not anymore, not really, just a corner, just a coffee shop, just a city block in a life that has, finally, fully, become entirely mine again. I got home a little after 9, made tea, sat at my kitchen table with the new case file open one more time, not because it needed more work that night, but because I've found, in the last year, that there's a specific comfort in simply sitting with proof, complete and undeniable, laid out in front of me in my own handwriting, in my own composition notebook. A comfort that has nothing to do with the case itself, and everything to do with what the act represents. A woman who once had to hide her own investigation from the man sleeping upstairs, now sitting alone, at peace, in a home entirely her own, doing the work she was always going to end up doing, for herself first, this time, before anyone else ever gets to benefit from it. My phone buzzed once more that night, close to 11, and for a half second, my whole body went rigid, the old vigilance flaring back up instantly, the specific full-body alertness I associate now, permanently, with unexpected notifications after dark, but it wasn't Terre Haute. It was Vanessa, our now monthly check-in a few days early, a single text, "Got a promotion today, team lead. Thought you'd want to know since you're basically the reason I finally figured out how to have a real job." I sat there for a long moment looking at that message, feeling something loosen in my chest that had been tight, I realized, since the moment the earlier text had arrived 6 weeks before, and I typed back, "So proud of you, dinner soon?" and set the phone down and finished my tea and thought, before I finally went to bed that night, about how strange and unpredictable repair actually is, how it never arrives in the shape you'd expect, How the family that once made me feel smaller in every room I entered had, somehow, in the wreckage of everything it lost, produced one person who genuinely changed. And how I have learned, across these 2 years, to hold that fact right alongside everything else I know to be true. That people can be exactly as capable of harm as I once documented, in exhaustive, unforgivable detail, and also, some of them, eventually, capable of becoming something better than the pattern I once watched them repeat, week after week, dinner after dinner, without a single flicker of change, until, finally, impossibly, for exactly one of them, there was one. I turned the lights off in my kitchen a little after midnight that Friday, and I stood for a moment in the dark of my own living room, looking out at the specific skyline view I'd chosen this condo for. The one thing I'd let myself be purely, uncomplicatedly indulgent about when I bought this place with money that was, finally, entirely, undisputedly mine. And I thought about the fact that Monday morning, outside counsel would take over the new case, that the 29-year-old daughter in that family would, within a matter of weeks, receive a phone call that would begin unraveling the same kind of double life I once lived for 19 months without anyone to share it with. And I found myself hoping, with a specificity that surprised me, that she has a brother like mine, a lawyer like Priya, a mother who tells her to gather everything first and feel it after, because that is the actual difference I've come to understand between surviving something like this and simply being destroyed by it. Not luck, not strength exactly, but whether, in the moment the ground opens up underneath you, there is a single person standing close enough to help you build something solid to stand on instead. I thought, too, one last time that night about Thornfield, the house with a name instead of an address, sold now to a family I've never met, its Chippendale furniture auctioned off 11 months ago at a fraction of the $60,000 appraisal Margaret once quoted me in that hallway. Its ballroom, the one with the chandelier, presumably still standing, still capable of throwing that same soft gold wash of light across whatever gathering happens underneath it next. Indifferent, the way rooms always are, to what they've witnessed. I don't know if the new owners know what happened there. I don't know if they'll ever be told, over some future dinner party, in the hushed, thrilled tone people reserve for a genuinely good scandal, about the night a federal arrest interrupted an award ceremony under their own chandelier. I find, mostly, that I don't think about it very often anymore, which is its own kind of ending, the quiet, undramatic kind that never makes it into the story itself. Not a final confrontation, not a courtroom verdict, just a woman standing in her own dark living room on an ordinary Friday night, genuinely, finally, thinking about something else entirely. I went to bed a few minutes after that, and I slept without waking once, which is, I should tell you, still not something I take for granted. 2 years out from a marriage that trained my whole nervous system to listen for the specific sound of a lie arriving late at night. I woke up Saturday morning to sunlight instead of a phone buzzing with bad news, made coffee, sat by the window with the new case file closed, finally, completely, and thought, for just a moment, before the day properly started, about the woman I was at 32, standing in a bathroom stall at the Drake Hotel, freezing an account with 15 seconds of quiet, deliberate action, no idea yet how far that single choice would eventually carry her. That Saturday, I drove out to Cicero for lunch with my parents, something I try to do most weekends now, not out of obligation but because I've learned, these last 2 years, exactly how much I value the specific, unglamorous ordinariness of that kitchen table. The same one where I learned to read a balance sheet before I learned to drive. The same one where my mother once told me, in the dark of a car ride home from a ballroom, that she would have done exactly what I did. My father was in the backyard when I arrived, doing something methodical to the gutters, the way he always is, and he came in halfway through lunch, hands still faintly smelling of the work, and sat down across from me and asked, the way he always asks, not "how are you," which he considers too vague a question to be useful, but "what are you working on?" And I told him about the shell company, the UPS store mailbox, the 6 related entities, and he listened the entire time with the specific, total attention he's given every account of my work since I was 19 years old, auditing a student organization's pizza budget, and when I finished, he nodded once and said, "Good, keep going," which is, from my father, the highest and most complete form of praise there is. I drove home that evening with the windows down, the last warm evening before the weather properly turned, and somewhere around the Kennedy Expressway I found myself thinking, unprompted, about Margaret's toast one final time. Really the last time, I think, that it will occupy this much space in my thoughts. because I've noticed, these last few months, that it surfaces less and less. The way any memory eventually does once it stops being the organizing principle of your entire life, and becomes, instead, simply one story among many. One chapter in a much longer book that has, thankfully, kept being written past the point where anyone thought it would end. "She's only here for the money," Margaret said and laughed, and 211 people laughed with her, and I sat there and said nothing. And I think now, driving home under a sky just starting to go orange at the edges, that the nothing I said that night was never actually silence. It was the first sentence of a much longer answer, one that took 19 months and a chandelier and a federal indictment to finally, completely finish saying out loud, and I would not, if you ask me tonight, change a single word of how long it took to say it right. I pulled into my building's garage a little after 8, took the elevator up, and let myself into a home that has, finally, after 2 years, stopped feeling like a place I retreated to, and started feeling, simply, like the place I live. And I was still holding my keys in my hand, still thinking about my father's 4 words. "Good, keep going," when my phone lit up on the counter with a name I hadn't expected to see again so soon, and the message underneath it made the entire evening's quiet fall away in a single instant. Because it wasn't from Vanessa, and it wasn't from Judith, and it wasn't, this time, from a blocked number in Terre Haute at all. It was from Priya. 3 words, no context, the exact kind of message that, after everything I've told you tonight, I have learned never, ever to open without bracing myself first. Call me now. My hands were already shaking before I even hit call, because I have learned, the hard way, exactly what "call me now" from a divorce attorney at 8 in the evening actually means. And Priya picked up on the first ring, no hello, just, "Elena, I need you to sit down. It's about the restitution account. Someone accessed it this afternoon, and it wasn't the court. You've made it this far into a story that took me 19 months to actually live, so you already know exactly how I handle a sentence like that one. If you want to see how far someone will go when they think you're too smart to catch, you already know where to find me next week, because this isn't the first time someone underestimated exactly how many receipts I keep. Like and subscribe now. If you've made it this far, you've already decided you're not missing what comes next.